across the shifting sands of southern Mesopotamia, where two great rivers once carved lifelines through the desert, something extraordinary was born. In this cradle of civilization, the earliest cities rose, vast temple complexes of mud brick and stone, crowned by towering ziggurats that seemed to touch the heavens. Here, for the first time, the idea of kingship took form. These were not rulers in the simple sense of warlords or chieftains. They were figures set apart, mediators between humanity and the divine, entrusted with order, justice, and the cosmic balance. In Uruk, Kish, Ur, and Akkad, the first monarchies emerged, inscribed upon clay tablets and immortalized in epic poetry. Their reigns straddle history and legend, their power proclaimed in both temple hymns and monumental ruins. Yet questions endure. Did kings truly rule by divine mandate, or were these myths carefully woven to sanctify power? Were these dynasties the architects of human progress, or fleeting shadows in an endless cycle of rise and fall? This is the story of the world's first monarchies of Mesopotamian Kingship, a journey across 4 hours of ancient memory, where archaeology, myth, and mystery intertwine. Let us begin where kingship itself is said to have descended from the heavens. Chapter 1. The Cradle of Kingship at Uruk, the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers slowly shaped fertile plains out of desert. A city emerged unlike any seen before. It was called Uruk. To the people of its time, it was not merely a settlement of mud brick and reed. It was the threshold between earth and heaven, a place where humanity's relationship with the divine began to take architectural form. Around 4000 to 3000 BCE, Uruk rose into prominence, becoming what many historians regard as the first true city. Its crowded streets, monumental buildings, and vast temple precincts reveal not just an urban revolution, but the very birth of organized kingship. As one wanders imaginatively through its ancient ruins, the skyline of Uruk begins to take shape. Towering above its surroundings stood the temples of the gods, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, war and fertility, and to Anu, the sky god who presided over celestial order. Their presence was more than symbolic. These temples embodied a new system of authority, one where the sacred and the political merged into a single unbroken chain of power. The ruler was not simply an administrator of earthly affairs. He was the intermediary, the chosen figure who stood between the divine and the human. Archaeologists excavating Uruk in the 20th century unearthed layers of monumental construction. Ziggurats rose in successive stages, each brick pressed with the thumbprints of workers long forgotten. In their sheer scale, these structures proclaimed something unprecedented: the coordination of thousands under a central command, working not only for survival but for a vision that transcended the immediate needs of daily life. To build such monuments required more than labor. It required leadership, ritual, and belief in a figure who embodied both worldly authority and divine will. Among the treasures of Uruk, one artifact speaks with particular clarity: the Walk of Ars, crafted around 3200 BCE and found in the precinct of Inanna's temple. Carved into its surface are bands of imagery, rising like steps of meaning. At the bottom, reeds and animals. Above them, offerings of grain and fruit. Higher still, a procession of men bearing gifts. And at the top, a figure thought to represent either the goddess herself or her priest-king intermediary. This vertical composition is not accidental. It is a cosmology in miniature, showing the ascent from earth to divinity, from sustenance to ritual, from mortal to ruler. In the imagery of the vase, kingship appears not as a mere political invention, but as part of the natural order. Yet here too, the questions begin. Who was this ruler represented in the imagery? Was he a king in the later sense, commanding armies and laws? Or was he primarily a priestly figure, channeling offerings upward to the gods? In Uruk, these roles seem indistinguishable. The ruler's authority was sanctified not by conquest alone, but by ritual, by the very act of sustaining the gods with offerings drawn from the labor of his people. The boundaries between temple and palace, between cult and court, are blurred, leaving us uncertain where religion ended and monarchy began. Uruk was not only a religious and political center, it was also a hub of innovation. The earliest known examples of writing, in the form of proto-cuneiform tablets, were found here. These tablets record grain rations, deliveries of livestock, and allocations of labor. In the dry strokes of clay emerges a striking image. Kingship was not only divine, but bureaucratic, rooted in the meticulous control of resources. To rule meant to feed, to build, to organize. Without such records, the vast machine of Uruk could not have functioned. The pen, or rather the stylus, was as vital to early kingship as the crown. And yet beneath these practical foundations lies the enduring sense of mystery. Uruk's myths, preserved centuries later in Sumerian hymns and in the epic traditions of Gilgamesh, portray its rulers as larger than life. Figures who stood not merely as men, but as demigods, straddling the boundary between mortal and eternal. Did the citizens of Uruk truly believe their king was part divine? Or was this a narrative carefully cultivated to ensure obedience, to cloak authority in the unreachable realm of heaven? The archaeological record does not answer, but it hints at the weight of belief that once infused every brick and offering. The walls of Uruk themselves speak of kingship's grandeur. Ancient texts describe them as vast and gleaming, stretching miles around the city. Some scholars attribute their construction to Gilgamesh, the semi-mythical king of Uruk, whose epic journey sought immortality, but found only the endurance of his works. While the true builders remain uncertain, the symbolism is unmistakable. The wall was both boundary and declaration, an earthly counterpart to divine protection. To live within Uruk's walls was to live under the protection of both king and god. It is tempting to see Uruk as the singular birthplace of monarchy, the place where kingship first descended from the heavens. But archaeology reminds us to be cautious. Other early centers, such as Kish and Eridu, also lay claim to primordial authority. The Sumerian King List, a text compiled much later, insists that kingship was passed from city to city as dynasties rose and fell. According to that record, Uruk was but one in a chain of divine bestowals, and yet its ruins remain among the most evocative, as though history itself wished to preserve Uruk's primacy in memory. The deeper one looks into Uruk, the more the lines blur. Was monarchy born here, or was this merely one of many experiments in human governance? One that happened to leave behind monumental traces? Were its rulers genuine intermediaries between humanity and the gods? Or were they powerful organizers cloaked in ritual language? The truth lies somewhere in the silence of ruins, in the fragments of vases, tablets, in ziggurat foundations. What remains undeniable is this. In Uruk, the idea of kingship took on a shape so powerful that it would echo across millennia. The image of the ruler as more than human, as guardian of divine order, as orchestrator of city and cosmos alike. This vision was carved here, on clay and stone, in the first great city of mankind, and so we leave Uruk in its desert silence, its sun-baked ruins whispering of beginnings. The first monarchies of Mesopotamia are born here, but their story does not end within its walls. From Uruk, kingship will spread outward, carried to new cities, inscribed upon new tablets, and reshaped by the hands of time. As the rivers flow, so too does authority drift, from city to city, dynasty to dynasty. Yet the question lingers still. Was Uruk truly the cradle of kingship, or merely the first surviving echo of a much older tradition, now lost to memory? Chapter 2. The Sumerian King. List carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago, the Sumerian King List is not simply a record of rulers. It is a vision of time itself, inscribed in cuneiform wedges that stretch from the depths of myth into the edges of history. On its tablets, kings rise and fall, dynasties are born and extinguished, and entire cities flicker in and out of the narrative as if they were stages in a cosmic drama. What distinguishes this list from other chronicles of power is the audacity of its scope. It does not begin with a founding warlord or a remembered ancestor. Instead, it opens with a claim of staggering weight, that kingship itself descended from heaven. The earliest rulers named in the king list are not presented as men in the ordinary sense. Their reigns stretch for impossibly long spans, some for hundreds, others for thousands of years. The very first, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalangar, ruled for 36,000. The list tells us these were the primordial kings, shepherds chosen by the gods to order a newly formed world. For modern readers, such durations invite disbelief, yet within the worldview of early Mesopotamia, they reflected not exaggeration, but a reality where the human and divine were inseparable. The first cities, newly risen from mud, brick and reed, could not conceive of leadership as anything less than cosmic. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple copies of the King List across Mesopotamia. Fragments at Nippur, Lhasa, and the famous Well-Blundell Prism housed today in Oxford. Each copy varies in small details, yet they all preserve the same underlying structure. Kingship begins in Eridu, the first city. It passes in sequence from city to city, dynasty to dynasty. Floods and calamities mark transitions, mirroring the rhythms of myth. At times, entire cities vanish from the account, while others appear only briefly, lending the impression that the text is less a ledger of fact than a tapestry of selective memory. The list is divided in two great movements. The first recounts the antediluvian kings, those who reigned before the flood. Their reigns are impossibly long, stretching beyond human comprehension. Then comes the cataclysm. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended again from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Here, the list turns towards something more historically plausible. The reigns shorten. The names begin to resonate with archaeological traces, cities we can excavate, rulers whose monuments remain, dynasties whose power shaped the land between the rivers. Yet the aura of myth never fully fades. The flood itself echoes the great deluge described in Mesopotamian epics, and its shadow lingers over the kings who followed. What was the purpose of such a text? To the Sumerians, it was far more than a list. It was a theology of authority. By tracing kingship back to divine descent, the text asserted that rulers were not merely the products of war, chance, or negotiation. They were ordained, woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. In this way, the King List became a tool of legitimacy. When one city conquered another, its rulers could inscribe their dynasty into the sequence, presenting themselves not as usurpers, but as rightful heirs to a timeless tradition. Political propaganda and sacred narrative intertwined until they were inseparable. Consider the city of Uruk, whose kings Gilgamesh and his successors appear on the list. Gilgamesh, half god and half man, straddles the line between history and myth. To include him was to bridge the human and divine, grounding political authority in the stories sung by generations. Or consider Kish, which after the flood became the symbolic seat of kingship. Its rulers could claim to be the first legitimate kings of the New World. In each case, the text not only remembered, but also shaped memory, deciding which rulers would live forever in clay and which would fade into silence. Scholars have long debated how much history lies beneath the surface. Some argue that behind the exaggeration of years, real rulers can be discerned, perhaps dynasts whose reigns were later magnified into myth. Others see the text as a deliberate construction, written to serve shifting political needs rather than to preserve objective truth. The extreme longevity of the early kings may echo astronomical cycles, ritual calendars, or symbolic numerology rather than literal chronology. In the act of recording, the scribes were less concerned with our modern sense of accuracy than with weaving a narrative that bound past, present, and cosmic order together. The discovery of these tablets in the early 20th century caused a stir precisely because they blurred lines so profoundly. Here was a document that resembled a royal chronicle, yet opened with statements more akin to scripture than history. It seemed to affirm the Mesopotamian obsession with origins, not only where cities came from, but where the right to rule itself was born. In this way, the King List stands as both artifact and enigma. Its endurance across centuries suggests its deep importance. Copies were made and recopied, long after the dynasties it described had passed. Each generation of scribes added their touch, yet the framework remained. Kingship descends, reigns unfold, floods cleanse, and succession begins anew. Through it all, the central theme persists. The king is not chosen by men alone, but by heaven. For us, reading these words today, the effect is haunting. We stand before a text that claims to bridge the mythical and the real, where numbers defy reason, yet names anchor us to the soil of Mesopotamia. Was it a distorted memory of ancient events, preserved across millennia? Or was it a deliberate myth, written to sanctify authority and give rulers the aura of the eternal? Perhaps it is both. A palimpsest where truth and myth have fused so completely that separation is impossible. And so the Sumerian King List endures, not as a solved puzzle, but as a voice across time. It whispers of kings who reigned for thousands of years, of floods that reshaped the world, of cities rising and falling beneath the gaze of heaven. It is a reminder that in the ancient mind, history was never merely a record. It was a sacred drama in which human rulers were threads woven into the design of the divine. As we leave the cuneiform tablets behind and step deeper into the stories of these early kings, we are left with an echoing question. When we speak of the first monarchs of Mesopotamia, are we remembering flesh and blood rulers, or shadows cast by myth upon the walls of time? Chapter 3. The White Temple of Uruk high upon an artificial mountain of mud brick, beneath the unrelenting Mesopotamian sun, once stood a sanctuary unlike any other, the White Temple of Uruk. Constructed around 3500 BCE, it rose above the surrounding city not as a dwelling for men, but as a meeting place between earth and the divine. The temple itself, gleaming with a coat of white gypsum plaster, would have caught the light of day and glowed like a beacon across the plain. For the people below, its presence was inescapable. It dominated not only the skyline, but also the imagination, a constant reminder that their world was governed by powers greater than themselves. At the base stretched the vast city of Uruk, its streets alive with merchants, farmers and artisans. But high above them, on the ziggurat platform, the White Temple embodied a higher order. Archaeologists describe it as a modest structure in size, yet its symbolic power was immense. The temple was dedicated to Anu, the sky god, whose authority transcended both heaven and earth. To ascend the steps of its platform was not a simple act of climbing. It was a ritual journey, a deliberate passage from the realm of humanity into the domain of the divine. In this ascent, the figure of the king played a central role. In Uruk, as in much of Sumer, the ruler was not merely a political administrator. He was also a priest, the chosen mediator between people and gods. When the king climbed those steps, he carried the weight of his city's prayers and offerings. Every ritual act performed at the summit was at once a service to the gods and an assertion of royal power. The merging of throne and altar, of crown and temple, was embodied in the White Temple itself. The stark whiteness of the building was not accidental. In a land where most structures were built from sun-dried mud brick, the use of gypsum plaster created a striking, almost otherworldly presence. Under the blazing sun, the temple would have shimmered in brightness, visible from miles away. At night, under starlight and firelight, its pale walls must have appeared ghostly, as if the gods themselves dwelled within its radiance. Such imagery reinforced the notion that the king who served within was not an ordinary man, but one standing at the threshold of heaven. Inside, the temple was arranged to facilitate ritual. A central hall stretched inward, flanked by smaller rooms, with a raised platform at the far end where offerings could be made. Archaeologists have found evidence of fire pits, offering tables, and votive deposits. Clay cones once decorated its outer walls in geometric patterns, giving texture and vibrancy to the glowing facade. Every element was designed to frame the interaction between human devotion and divine presence. The temple was not merely a house for a statue of a god, it was the axis of the city's spiritual life. Yet even here, questions remain. Was the White Temple primarily the seat of royal propaganda, a stage upon which kings displayed their connection to heaven? Or was the king himself secondary, a servant who entered the presence of the gods with humility, offering gifts on behalf of his people? The answer is not clear. In the absence of texts directly describing the rituals, we are left with fragments of architecture and inference. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The king was servant and sovereign alike, diminished before the gods, yet magnified before men by his ability to mediate their will. The temple's elevated platform also speaks to deeper symbolism. In Mesopotamian thought, height was not merely practical, it was sacred. To build upwards was to approach the heavens, to create an artificial mountain on the flat floodplain. The White Temple thus stood as a man-made horizon, a place where the earthly and celestial touched. Later, ziggurats would embody this symbolism even more dramatically, but the White Temple was among the first. It set the precedent for millennia of sacred architecture, where the ascent to the temple became a physical metaphor for the ascent of the soul. In considering its role, one must also remember Uruk's extraordinary transformation in this period. It was the world's first great city, swelling to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. Its streets hummed with trade, its artisans experimented with writing, and its farmers channeled the waters of the Euphrates into vast irrigation systems. At the heart of this new urban experiment, the White Temple proclaimed that order and prosperity were not solely human achievements. They were blessings bestowed by the gods, channeled through the sacred kingship of Uruk's rulers. The temple's prominence reminded every citizen that life in the city was woven into a larger divine fabric. And yet, the White Temple itself did not endure. Like so many Mesopotamian structures, built of fragile mud brick, it eroded and was eventually buried beneath the sands of time. What survives today are its foundations, exposed by the archaeologist Julius Jordan in the early 20th century. Standing among those ruins, one can only imagine the brilliance of its whitewashed walls, the solemnity of its rituals, the echo of footsteps climbing toward the sky. The silence of its remains only deepens the mystery. What prayers were once spoken there? What songs once filled its chamber? What gestures of kingship bound earth and heaven in that sacred space? The White Temple of Uruk is remembered not only as an architectural achievement, but as a symbol. It represents the earliest fusion of religion and monarchy, of sacred duty and political authority. It stands at the threshold where kingship became not just the rule of men, but the embodiment of divine order. Whether the ruler stood there as master of ritual or as humble servant, the temple ensured that kingship could never be separated from the gods. As we descend the steps of its ruined platform in imagination, we are left with the lingering image of its radiant facade, gleaming like a beacon in the dawn of history. Was it a monument to royal power draped in sacred imagery? Or was it truly the house of the gods, where kings themselves bent the knee? The question remains unanswered, suspended in the brightness of that vanished temple, as the story of Mesopotamian kingship continues to unfold. Chapter 4. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Urukin. The long corridors of Mesopotamian memory. No figure looms larger than Gilgamesh. To speak his name is to evoke a king who was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a paradox in human form. He is remembered not only as a ruler of Uruk, but as a hero who wrestled with gods, challenged the boundaries of mortality, and sought wisdom at the edges of the world. His legend, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, stands as one of humanity's earliest great works of literature, written in cuneiform upon clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago. But behind the poetry, behind the myth of monsters and gods, there may have stood a man. Archaeological evidence suggests that around 2700 BCE, a ruler named Gilgamesh, or Bilgamesh, as his name appears in Sumerian, reigned in Uruk during the city's early dynastic period. His deeds are faintly recorded in inscriptions, and his place among the kings of Sumer appears in the Sumerian King List. Yet the Gilgamesh of history, if he lived, is obscured beneath layers of myth so dense that it is difficult to tell where the king ends and the legend begins. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself is no simple tale of conquest or rule. It is, rather, a meditation on kingship, mortality, and the human condition. In its earliest Sumerian poems, Gilgamesh appears as a powerful king, sometimes arrogant, sometimes tyrannical, whose people plead to the gods for relief. The gods answer by creating Enkidu, a wild man fashioned of clay who becomes both Gilgamesh's rival and his dearest companion. Their friendship transforms Gilgamesh from an oppressor into a seeker, though their adventures also reveal the weight of divine boundaries. Together they slay Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and they kill the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar. Yet for these deeds, punishment falls. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is left to face the crushing truth of his own mortality. This is the heart of his story, the quest for immortality. Grieving, Gilgamesh wanders the earth in search of a way to escape death. He journeys to the ends of the world, crossing the waters of death to speak with Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian survivor of the Great Flood, who tells him the secret of everlasting life. But in the end, Gilgamesh fails. The plant of immortality slips from his grasp, stolen by a serpent, and he returns to Uruk with nothing but the wisdom that death is the fate of all. His final legacy is not immortality of the flesh, but immortality through story, through memory, through the walls of Uruk he built so proudly. The story of Gilgamesh embodies the dual nature of Mesopotamian kingship. He is a man of extraordinary power yet bound by limits, a king who bears divine blood yet cannot escape human death. In him, the Sumerians expressed the paradox of kingship itself. Rulers were chosen by the gods, elevated above ordinary men, but never free of their mortality. Kings could channel divine will, but they could not overturn it. The tension between human ambition and divine decree runs through every line of the epic, as it ran through every coronation and every reign in Mesopotamia. For historians, Gilgamesh presents an enduring puzzle. The Sumerian King List places him as the fifth king of Uruk, reigning after the Great Flood. Archaeological evidence from Uruk's early dynastic layers hints at a time of powerful rulers, fortified city walls, and intense urban growth. Some scholars argue that Gilgamesh may have been a historical king whose reign was later mythologized, much as Arthur was in Britain. Others suggest the opposite, that the myth of Gilgamesh was used by later rulers to sanctify their own dynasties, projecting an image of divine kingship back into Uruk's past. What is clear is that the legend of Gilgamesh endured far beyond his supposed lifetime. His epic was copied for over 1,000 years, carried into the libraries of Babylon and Assyria. When Ashurbanipal's great library at Nineveh was excavated in the 19th century, fragments of the epic were discovered. Pieces of clay inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform that, when translated, revealed echoes of a world half remembered. For Victorian scholars, the parallels between Utnapishtim's flood and the biblical story of Noah were startling, raising questions about the deep roots of ancient traditions. For us today, the epic still resonates with its timeless themes of friendship, loss, and the longing for eternity. Archaeologists searching for traces of Gilgamesh have not been idle. In 2003, a German team announced the discovery of what they believed could be the remains of a royal tomb beneath the ancient riverbeds of Uruk. Some speculated, cautiously, that it might be connected to Gilgamesh himself. Though unproven, the very idea reflects how the boundary between archaeology and legend blurs in Mesopotamia. Each layer of earth seems to hide not just bricks and bones, but echoes of the half-divine kings, whose names still reverberate across millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh also shaped how Mesopotamians understood their kings. By presenting a ruler who was at once powerful and flawed, divine yet mortal, the story provided a model for kingship. It warned rulers not to overreach, not to believe themselves gods, and yet it sanctified their role as intermediaries between humanity and the heavens. In this sense, the legend was both myth and political philosophy, a narrative that guided rulers as much as it entertained audiences. We might also see Gilgamesh as a mirror of the human condition. His quest for immortality is our quest. His grief at Enkidu's death echoes the grief of countless mourners across history. His final realization, that life's meaning lies not in escaping death but in shaping a legacy, remains as true today as it was in the dawn of cities. That such insights could be inscribed upon clay in the 3rd millennium BCE and carried forward to us across fire and ruin is itself a kind of immortality. Still, the question lingers. Was Gilgamesh truly a king who once ruled Uruk's bustling streets, whose hands touched the bricks of the walls that still lie buried beneath the desert sands? Or was he always a figure of myth, a creation woven to give divine legitimacy to Uruk's dynasty? The tablets do not tell us. The ruins remain silent. What endures is the story, the tale of a king who stood at the threshold between man and God, between history and legend. As we step away from his shadow, the mystery remains. Gilgamesh endures as both man and myth, his voice rising from broken clay to remind us that kingship was never merely about power. It was about the fragile balance between mortality and divinity, between ambition and acceptance. And in that balance, the people of Uruk found the shape of their world. Chapter 5. The royal tombs of beneath the desert sands of southern Mesopotamia. In what was once the great Sumerian city of Ur, archaeologists uncovered a silence that had endured for nearly 5,000 years. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley led excavations into a vast necropolis, a place where rulers were laid to rest around 2600 BCE. What he found astonished the world. These were not simple graves of kings and queens. They were royal tombs, deep shafts cut into the earth, filled with treasures of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and shell. But they were also filled with something darker. The bodies of attendants, soldiers, musicians, and servants, sacrificed to accompany their monarchs into the shadowed realm of the afterlife. Among the most striking discoveries was the tomb of Queen Puabi. Unlike most rulers of the age, Her name was preserved not only in artifacts, but on a cylinder seal found within her grave. Her burial chamber was adorned with a headdress of dazzling artistry, gold ribbons woven like leaves, lapis lazuli beads, and delicate rosettes that crowned her skull. She lay surrounded by jewelry, weapons, and vessels of precious materials, as though her very presence was meant to echo divine radiance. The wealth of her tomb suggests that she was not a consort, but a sovereign in her own right, a queen whose authority commanded devotion in both life and death. But it was the so-called death pits that raised the greatest questions. Dozens of attendants lay in ordered rows beside her, their bodies adorned with jewelry and ornaments, their hands still upon the lyres, harps, and drinking cups they once held. The famous Great Lyre of decorated with golden bulls' heads and intricate inlay, was found among them. Its presence implies that music itself was a companion for the journey into eternity. The attendants appear not to have struggled. Their bodies were laid neatly, as if they went willingly, or perhaps under the influence of ritual drink or narcotic. Whether voluntary or coerced, their deaths were part of a ceremony that fused devotion, spectacle, and fear. What kind of kingship required such rituals? For the rulers of power was not simply administrative, it was sacred. To be monarch was to stand at the threshold between humanity and the gods, to embody divine order within the city. Death, then, was not an end but a transformation. The afterlife of such rulers could not be faced alone. They required an entourage, a court that would continue to serve them in eternity as they had in life. In this belief, the line between king and god blurred. To serve the king, even in death, may have been regarded as an act of cosmic duty. Yet even as we admire the artistry of these tombs, unease lingers. What compelled dozens of men and women to surrender their lives at the death of another? Did they believe they would awaken alongside their sovereign in another world? Or were they caught in the machinery of ritual, powerless to refuse? Archaeological evidence suggests that attendants were dispatched with cups of poison rather than brute force, but the deeper truth remains hidden. Were they martyrs to devotion or victims of power? The treasures themselves whisper of far-reaching connections. Lapis lazuli, mined in the distant mountains of Afghanistan, found its way into the jewelry of Ur's queens. Gold likely traveled from Anatolia or Iran, and shell inlays came from the Persian Gulf. The royal tombs of were not isolated wonders. They were the culmination of vast trade networks that stretched across continents. To walk among the treasures is to glimpse a world already global in scope, where kingship rested not only on ritual power, but on the wealth and prestige drawn from distant lands. One of the most haunting images uncovered was that of the so-called ram in a thicket, a statuette of a goat rearing up to eat the leaves of a golden tree, its body covered in gold and lapis. To some, it symbolized fertility and renewal. To others, divine abundance. But when placed among the bodies of the dead, it takes on a more somber resonance, a symbol of life set amid silence. Such juxtapositions remind us that Mesopotamian kingship was not only about glory, but about negotiating the fragile line between life, death, and eternity. For Woolley, the excavator, these finds offered a glimpse into a monarchy that fused splendor and solemnity in equal measure. He wrote of the overwhelming sense of reverence that surrounded the discoveries, even as he and his team brushed away the sand from golden headdresses and lyres. But modern scholars continue to wrestle with their meaning. Were these rulers seen as gods themselves, demanding eternal service? Or were they instead bound by an ideology that emphasized service to the gods in perpetuity, with their attendants as offerings for divine favor? What is certain is that these burials reveal a worldview steeped in both opulence and inevitability. Kingship in was not merely earthly administration. It was a sacred performance that extended beyond life itself. The treasures and sacrifices ensured that the ruler's authority would echo into eternity, as enduring as the bricks of their temples and the hymns sung in their honor. In this sense, the royal tombs of stand as both monuments to devotion and as reminders of the human cost of divine kingship. Even today, the artifacts speak. The lyres, when reconstructed, can still be played, their ancient melodies echoing faintly across time. The jewelry glimmers as brightly as it did beneath the Mesopotamian sun, and the bones, carefully catalogued, remind us of the lives surrendered in service to ideals we may never fully comprehend. Each object is a fragment of a vanished world, where death was orchestrated as part of the cosmic order, and where monarchy was enshrined in ritual as much as in politics. As we leave the tombs behind, we carry with us more than admiration for their artistry. We carry questions about power, about faith, about the line between ruler and god. Were these graves monuments of love and loyalty, or of fear and compulsion? Did the attendants believe in their eternal journey, or did they simply have no choice? The silence of does not answer. It only deepens the mystery. And so, in the shadows of the royal tombs, we glimpse the fragile truth of kingship in ancient Mesopotamia. A throne gilded in splendor, yet resting upon sacrifice. A monarchy radiant in gold and lapis, yet veiled in death. The answers remain buried with the kings and queens themselves, their secrets locked in the earth, awaiting voices that can no longer speak. Chapter 6. Kish and the Rise of Dynastic Authority. In the long shadow of Sumer's earliest cities, one name recurs again and again: Kish, to later scribes and to the Sumerian King List itself. Kish was the city where kingship first took root after the primordial flood, a flood that swept away an age of myth and left humanity to rebuild. In that sacred chronology, Kish was more than a settlement of brick and clay. It was the axis where divine mandate re-entered human history. Archaeology lends substance to this memory. Amid Kish's sprawling ruins, traces of monumental walls, temples, and palaces suggest a community that aspired not merely to survive, but to rule. The very phrase King of Kish became a title of extraordinary weight. For centuries, rulers from other cities claimed it, sometimes without ruling the city itself, because the title carried symbolic primacy. To call oneself the King of Kish was to claim dominion over Sumer as a whole. But why Kish? Why not Uruk, with its gleaming white temple, or with its royal graves steeped in splendor? Scholars have wrestled with this puzzle for decades. Some suggest geography. Kish lay at the northern edge of Sumer, close to the routes that connected Mesopotamia to lands beyond. Control of Kish meant influence not just within Sumer, but also across the trade arteries that pulsed with goods, ideas, and armies. Others argue the city's temples may have been tied to cults of legitimacy, anchoring the divine right of kings in rituals that echoed far beyond its walls. The early rulers of Kish loom half-seen in the fog of antiquity. Figures like Enmebaragasi, who according to inscriptions supplied stone for temples and fought wars against Elam, straddle the threshold of history and legend. His name is one of the first kings corroborated both by the King List and archaeological fragments, perhaps a ruler of flesh and blood who later became woven into myth. His son, Aga of Kish, is remembered not only in tablets but also in stories of Gilgamesh's defiance, where Uruk resisted Kish's overlordship. These tales suggest that Kish's power was real enough to be contested, and its authority fragile enough to inspire epic resistance. And yet, when we look closer, the story of Kish is not simply one of conquest or empire, it is a story of ideology. To call oneself King of Kish was to step into a lineage that reached back to the moment when kingship was said to have descended from heaven anew. The city's significance may not have rested on armies or walls alone, but on memory, myth, and the sacred narratives that bound together Sumerian thought. Kish reminds us that power in Mesopotamia was never just a matter of swords and tribute. It was also theatre, symbolism, and divine claim. In the dust of its ruins, we see how fragile authority could be, and how eagerly rulers sought to clothe themselves in legitimacy older than their own reigns. The question remains, did Kish truly dominate the cities of Sumer, or did it simply lend its name to those who longed for cosmic validation? The city itself offers only fragments, mud brick foundations, scattered inscriptions, broken vessels. Yet in those fragments lies the echo of a great idea, that kingship was not simply a local affair, but a universal order radiating from a chosen center. Kish may have been modest compared to Uruk or but in the imagination of Mesopotamia, it was a city of firsts, a place where dynastic authority crystallized, where the title of king transcended the individual and became an institution. In the shifting sands of Mesopotamian history, Kish's primacy would fade, replaced by new centers of power, but its memory endured, enshrined in lists and legends, invoked by rulers seeking legitimacy for centuries after its walls had crumbled. Its story is a reminder that cities are not remembered only for what they build, but for the meanings they carry. Kish's gift to Mesopotamian kingship was not empire, it was identity. Chapter 7. The Flood and the Rebirth of Kingship. Long before history was etched into stone, Mesopotamian memory spoke of a rupture, a calamity so profound it divided time into a before and an after, the Great Flood. In the Sumerian King List, the narrative unfolds with eerie clarity. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, Kish became the seat of kingship. These lines are more than record, they are proclamation. Kingship, once lost in the waters, returned renewed. The flood, in their eyes, was not simply a natural event. It was a cosmic erasure, a cleansing of dynasties, a resetting of divine order. Archaeology gives whispers to these ancient words. In cities such as Shuruppak, Uruk, and Kish, excavations have revealed thick bands of riverine silt, cutting across the layers of habitation. At Shuruppak, today's Farah, a striking stratum of flood-deposited clay, nearly 5 feet deep, separates one age from the next. Radiocarbon dates place this watery catastrophe around 2900 BCE, aligning with the memory preserved in texts. Yet, as with all things in Mesopotamia, the evidence is not uniform. Other sites, like and Lagash, show no such break, as if the deluge had been regional rather than universal. Was this the flood of memory, or one of many lesser inundations magnified into myth? Still, for the Mesopotamians, precision did not matter. The flood was archetype. It explained the fragility of cities, the sudden silencing of dynasties, the way a ruler's power could vanish as swiftly as rising waters. The world of clay tablets and temple bricks was precarious, pressed against the volatile flow of the Tigris and Euphrates. Flooding was a seasonal companion, but once perhaps, it surged beyond endurance. From that moment, the collective memory made catastrophe sacred. In their myths, the flood was not mere accident, it was decree. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the immortal survivor Utnapishtim recounts how the gods resolved to annihilate humankind with waters. The storm raged for 6 days and nights, and when silence returned, all life lay drowned. Only those aboard the great vessel survived to begin again. In this telling, the flood is not only destruction, it is covenant. Kingship, bestowed after the waters, carried the weight of survival. Rulers were the heirs of catastrophe, chosen to ensure order where once there was chaos. The King List echoes this cosmic restart. Cities and rulers before the flood are given reigns that stretch into the impossible, tens of thousands of years, a mythology of deep antiquity. But after the flood, reigns grow shorter, more human, as though divine grandeur had been humbled. It is a portrait of a world remade, gods no longer bestowing near-eternal lifespans, but instead requiring rulers of clay and blood, mortals who would die but carry divine order while alive. The city of Kish emerges here, named as the first to bear kingship after the flood. This detail is not random. To rule from Kish was to hold a legitimacy rooted not only in conquest, but in cosmic renewal. Dynasties that followed could trace their right to govern back through Kish, and through Kish, back through the waters of the deluge, to the gods themselves. Kingship was not just governance, it was proof of divine patience after divine wrath. Yet there is unease in this legacy. Was the flood a memory of an actual inundation sweeping Mesopotamia's riverine plains, or was it a myth crafted to explain dynastic breaks? Archaeologists debate the layers of clay, the uneven distribution of evidence, the dates that shift between sites. Some suggest that a catastrophic flooding of the Euphrates around 2900 BCE may have devastated key cities, inspiring a shared memory of cosmic annihilation. Others argue that repeated local floods, each traumatic in its own way, were woven together into one great archetypal deluge. In myth, many floods collapsed into one, the ultimate flood, the one that erased kings and forced heaven to descend anew. In this blurred seam between soil and story lies the genius of Mesopotamian kingship. Rulers were not simply administrators of cities. They were survivors of divine judgment, heirs of a world rescued from drowning. Their palaces and temples, their titles and ceremonies bore the weight of this survival. To rule after the flood was to live in the shadow of loss, to remember that the gods could take everything away, and so kingship was wrapped in ritual. Temples rose upon ziggurat platforms, lifting sanctuaries high above the floodplain, as though defiance or remembrance of waters past. Ceremonies reenacted renewal, with kings humbling themselves before the gods each new year, to ensure that order endured against the chaos always threatening to return. Even when centuries passed without calamity, the flood remained present in memory, a silent axis upon which history turned. In the wider world, echoes of this Mesopotamian story ripple outward. The Hebrew Bible's account of Noah, the Akkadian Atrahasis, the later Babylonian retelling with Utnapishtim, all carry the same memory of water's arc and survival. Whether borrowed, adapted, or born from shared trauma, the flood became a universal metaphor of divine judgment and mercy. But here, in Mesopotamia, it was also a foundation for monarchy itself. Kingship was not only political, it was cosmic restoration. When archaeologists walk the ruins of Shuruppak or sift through the silts of Kish, they are not only unearthing clay, they are brushing against the edges of this ancient memory. They find the sediments of a real flood, but also the residues of an idea that human rule is fragile, contingent, provisional, and that legitimacy must always be traced back to the gods who once destroyed and then renewed. Thus, every king of Sumer bore the unspoken burden of that flood. Each dynasty that rose could be washed away. Each brick laid in a city wall was a defense not only against enemies, but against memory itself. The memory of waters that once silenced all voices. The flood, then, was both history and symbol. It was catastrophe and covenant, ruin and rebirth. It gave kingship its paradoxical quality, at once temporary, bound to the mortality of clay, and eternal, grounded in divine choice after the great cleansing. In this way, Mesopotamian monarchy was forever haunted, forever humbled by the waters of 2900 BCE, or by the idea of them. Even now, the silence of those clay strata speaks. It whispers that civilization itself is precarious, that all human order balances upon the edge of catastrophe. Mesopotamians knew this, and so they cast their kings not as mere rulers, but as survivors, stewards of a world fragilely remade. And yet, questions linger. Was the flood of their memory a single cataclysm, or 1,000 local disasters given one mythic shape? Did the gods of Sumer truly erase and renew kingship? Or did scribes and dynasties weave this story to sanctify their own beginnings? In the absence of certainty, the story endures, half clay, half myth, wholly haunting. The flood does not end the story of Mesopotamia. It is only a threshold. Beyond it lies a reborn world of kings and cities, temples and dynasties, each one bearing the memory of waters still waiting at the edge of time. Chapter 8. Lagash and the reform of Uruk. Among the shifting sands of southern Mesopotamia lies Lagash, a city whose voice still lingers across millennia through broken tablets and fading inscriptions. While Uruk and Kish proclaim the grandeur of kingship, and Gilgamesh embodied the divine warrior king, Lagash offers us another story. Here, in the 3rd millennium BCE, the ideals of justice and protection emerged as the language of monarchy, and at its center stands Uruk, a ruler remembered not for conquest or vast monuments, but for reform. The reign of Uruk around 2350 BCE is marked by a series of inscriptions carved in cuneiform. Their tone is striking, where so many Mesopotamian kings boasted of battles won, walls built, or temples dedicated. Uruk proclamations speak instead of social wrongs, and the attempt to correct them. He addressed widows and orphans, the vulnerable who so often disappeared into silence. He forbade the seizure of property from debtors, limiting the reach of creditors and officials. He sought to prevent priests and temple administrators from exploiting their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the poor. These measures, sometimes called the earliest recorded legal reforms, suggest that the idea of kingship in Lagash was not only divine mandate, but moral guardianship. The inscriptions hint at a society strained by inequality. Temples had become wealthy, and priests, often aligned with political power, held sway over land, labor, and offerings. The economic system of Sumer, with its entanglement of temple estates, palatial administration, and private holdings, created opportunities for exploitation. Uruk positioned himself against this tide, limiting the power of officials and protecting common households. One surviving text declares he established the freedom of the citizens of Lagash. The word, used Amagi, has been translated as freedom or return to mother, and some scholars see in it the first recorded expression of liberty in human history. Yet here, the mystery deepens. Was Uruk-agina truly a reformer moved by compassion, or a shrewd king using the mantle of morality to consolidate power? By curbing the wealth of temples, he weakened potential rivals. By proclaiming justice for the poor, he aligned himself with divine mandate. For in Mesopotamian thought, the king was expected to embody misharim, order, justice, balance. His inscriptions might reflect genuine ideals, or they might be a carefully constructed image designed to secure loyalty. History often preserves not intentions, but proclamations. Archaeological discoveries at Girsu, one of the cities under Lagash's control, give us fragments of these reforms. Clay cones and tablets, now scattered in museums, carry the words of Uruk-agina into our time. They describe restrictions on the lavish burial practices of the elite, prohibitions against officials taking bribes, and measures to protect farmers from unjust taxation. The detail is granular, touching on the price of goods, the rights of temple attendants, the fair distribution of offerings. For a moment, through these records, we glimpse a monarchy that sought to bind itself not only to gods, but to principles. But the world of Lagash was not stable. To its north, the kingdom of Umma contested the fertile lands of the Guedana plain. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma was fierce, centuries long, and drenched in blood. Uruk-agina, for all his reforms, was unable to protect Lagash from external aggression. The king of Umma, Lugal-Zargazi, rose as a formidable adversary, eventually defeating Uruk-agina and seizing control. In his own inscriptions, Lugal-Zargazi mocked the claims of his rival, boasting of conquest and divine favor. The reforms of Lagash ended as abruptly as they had begun, swept away by the tides of war. This fragility speaks to the precariousness of justice in early monarchies. Kingship could proclaim fairness and divine order, but armies and ambitions often dictated survival. Uruk-agina's vision, if it was vision, lasted scarcely a generation before the old cycles of conquest resumed, and yet the echo of his words endured. Later rulers, from Ur-Nammu of Ur to Hammurabi of Babylon, would issue their own codes, inscribing justice as central to monarchy. Was Uruk-agina their precursor, the first to bind power to moral proclamation, or was he merely one among many, his memory magnified because fragments of his reforms survived the centuries? The very survival of his texts raises questions. Why do we possess so many of his proclamations compared to other rulers of Lagash? Were his reforms celebrated in his own time, copied and preserved? Or did scribes in later generations preserve them precisely because they stood out as unusual? In the broken tablets, we cannot discern intention. We hear only the words as they were meant to be heard. A king presenting himself as guardian of the vulnerable, as restorer of balance, as servant of the gods through justice rather than war. And yet, Lagash itself does not speak in one voice. Other inscriptions from the city recount traditional boasts, conquests, offerings, divine favor. The tension between these two images, a king of reform and a king of politics, remains unresolved. In this ambiguity lies the enduring fascination of Uruk-agina. He is at once historical and elusive, a monarch of clay whose proclamations read like whispers of an ancient conscience. When we stand before the tablets in museums, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, we are confronted with a paradox. The words are familiar: protection of widows, orphans, the poor. They speak to values we still hold across time and cultures. Yet the context is alien, a world of temple estates, rival city-states, and divine kingship. Did Uruk-agina truly anticipate later ideas of justice, or are we projecting modern values upon ancient clay? The answer is unknowable, suspended between text and silence. In the end, Uruk-agina's reign reminds us that kingship in Mesopotamia was never one thing. It could be warrior and builder, priest and reformer, conqueror and caretaker. Each king carried divine legitimacy, but how that legitimacy was expressed varied with time and circumstance. In Lagash, for a brief moment, it was expressed as reform, a vision of justice written in clay, fragile as the city's own walls, soon to crumble before the ambitions of neighbors. The silence that followed his fall is telling. Later dynasties rarely invoked his name. His reforms did not survive in practice. Yet they survive in inscription, etched into the archaeology of memory. And so, thousands of years later, we still ask, was Uruk-agina a true reformer ahead of his time, or a monarch cloaking political maneuver in the language of morality? The clay does not answer. It offers only fragments, statements of freedom, decrees of protection, silences where motives should be. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing between idealism and politics, but in acknowledging that in early Mesopotamia, as in every age, power and justice were inseparable, bound together in fragile tension, and so, Lagash whispers to us not of victory, but of experiment. A moment when kingship sought to redefine itself, to clothe itself in justice rather than arms. A moment that passed but left behind a faint echo, a reminder that even in the earliest monarchies, rulers wrestled with questions larger than themselves. The reforms of Uruk may have vanished with his dynasty, but the idea that kingship must embody justice would ripple through Mesopotamian history, returning again and again in new forms. The broken tablets of Lagash are not merely relics of a lost city. They are reminders that even at the dawn of monarchy, humanity was already searching for fairness in the face of power. And yet, as with so many fragments of the past, we are left in quiet uncertainty. Was it morality or was it strategy? Was it vision or was it necessity? The truth lies buried, half lost in the ruins of Lagash, waiting for the next step in our journey through the forgotten monarchies of Mesopotamia. Chapter 9. The Stele of the Vultures Inn. The heat of southern Mesopotamia, where the land stretches wide between the rivers, a monument of stone rises from the shadows of time. Carved from limestone, weathered yet enduring, it bears the memory of both triumph and blood. This is the Stele of the Vultures, a relic of Lagash, and a testament to the violent heart of early kingship. Dating to around 2450 BCE, the Stele is one of the earliest known works of historical narrative art. Unlike simple boundary markers or temple inscriptions, it was made to tell a story. Its very surface is divided into registers, as though each panel carried a fragment of memory. Fragments that, when joined together, proclaimed the power of King Inanna of Lagash. One side of the Stele reveals the human realm. Soldiers march in ordered ranks, helmets upon their heads, spears and shields in disciplined formation. They advance as one, their king at the forefront, leading not merely with authority, but with sacred command. Their unity suggests something rare in the ancient world, a vision of the army as an extension of the king's body, disciplined and purposeful, a tool of divine order brought down upon chaos. The other side, however, shifts from the human to the divine. Here the god Ningirsu, patron of Lagash, towers over the scene, colossal and otherworldly. In his grasp, he holds a net brimming with the defeated enemies of Lagash, as though war itself were conducted by divine hands, with mortals only serving as instruments of execution. This duality, man and god, king and patron, is central to the Stele's power. It is not merely a record of conquest, but a theological argument in stone. The king does not simply win battles. He embodies the divine will. His violence is not cruelty, but justice, a restoration of balance under the gods. The monument suggests that warfare itself was sanctified, that order could only be preserved by the breaking of bodies and the spilling of blood. The name of the Stele comes from a grim detail. Scattered across its carved surfaces, vultures wheel in the sky above the battlefield, their wings outstretched as they feast upon the fallen. These carrion birds are not incidental. They are deliberate, reminders of what war leaves behind. To later eyes, they may seem a warning of horror, but to the ancient carvers of Lagash, they were part of the story of victory. The enemies of the king left unburied, abandoned as food for the gods' creatures. In their starkness, the vultures remind us of the cost of kingship and the thin line between divine triumph and human devastation. Archaeologists who uncovered the Stele in the late 19th century at Tello, the ancient city of Girsu within the territory of Lagash, pieced together its broken fragments. Much of the monument had been shattered, perhaps deliberately, perhaps by time. Yet even in fragments, its message rings clear. The careful ordering of soldiers, the towering presence of gods, the visceral imagery of the dead, all conspire to give us one of the earliest known propaganda tools in recorded history. But was it history, or was it theatre? Did Inanna truly command disciplined ranks of spearmen? Or is this order an artistic illusion meant to exaggerate the power of Lagash? Were the gods seen above the battlefield, or was their presence imagined to sanctify the king's rule? The Stele does not answer. It presents, it declares. It leaves the truth hanging between stone and silence. The political context deepens the mystery. Inanna's reign was marked by rivalry with neighboring Ummah, a city whose boundary disputes with Lagash over fertile fields sparked repeated conflict. The stele itself may have been less a celebration of a single victory than a warning. A boundary marker turned into sacred intimidation. To Umma it said, "This is what awaits those who defy the god of Lagash." To Lagash's people it said, "Your king is chosen by the divine to keep order through the sword." Through this dual message, the stele exemplifies how ancient monarchy intertwined violence with legitimacy. Kingship was not enough on its own. It required spectacle, narrative, and the constant reminder that the king's might was not personal ambition, but divine necessity. Without such sanctification, war would be nothing but bloodshed. With it, war became justice, and yet, as we gaze upon the vultures circling forever in carved stone, one cannot help but wonder if the people of Lagash truly believed this narrative, or if they simply endured it. Did farmers and laborers see in Inanna a protector blessed by Ningirsu? Or did they see only their sons and brothers marching away to feed the fields of vultures? The stone does not record their voices. Perhaps that is the greatest silence the stele of the vultures carries. It tells us how a king wanted to be remembered, but not how he was truly seen. It blurs the line between document and declaration, between history and propaganda. It reveals the ancient logic of kingship, that the power to kill and the power to rule were inseparable, and that even death itself could be transformed into a divine offering. The stele stands today as both artifact and riddle. Its carved soldiers still march, its vultures still descend, its god still looms. But what lies beneath is uncertain. Was this the memory of a true battle, a real clash upon the Sumerian plain? Or was it a crafted myth, a stone script meant to shape belief more than to reflect reality? In that question lingers the shadow of all ancient monuments. Were they mirrors of truth or tools of control? Were they built to preserve memory or to erase doubt? As the fragments of the stele rest in their museum cases, they whisper not only of Inanna's triumph, but of the enduring mystery of power, a mystery that will echo again in the chapters yet to come. Chapter 10. The Empire of Sargon of Akkadin. The long memory of Mesopotamia. Certain names shine with a brilliance that refuses to fade. Among them, none carries the same weight, the same aura of both legend and reality, as Sargon of Akkad. His story is the hinge upon which the ancient world turned, the moment when fragmented city-states began to yield to the concept of empire. Yet like all turning points, it is shadowed in uncertainty, bound up with myth, and spoken through the voices of those who wished to shape how he would be remembered. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon emerged from obscurity to seize control of Kish, and soon after, all of Sumer. The records describe him not as a prince nor a nobleman, but as a cupbearer, an attendant in the royal household, a servant to the throne he would one day claim. That sudden leap from servant to sovereign hints at either violent ambition or divine orchestration. Later generations could not decide, and so they spun tales that gave his life the texture of destiny. The most famous of these stories is the legend of Sargon. According to the tale, he was born to a priestess, but his very existence was forbidden. Placed in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch, he was set upon the river, an infant cast adrift into uncertainty. Carried by the currents, he was discovered and raised by a gardener. In time, he became the trusted cupbearer of the king of Kish, until the gods themselves elevated him to kingship. The story resonates with echoes that reach across cultures. A child abandoned on water, rescued for a greater purpose. It is a narrative that confers inevitability, that marks Sargon not as a man of chance, but as one chosen from birth by divine will. Historians debate whether this tale conceals a kernel of truth. Was Sargon truly of low birth, rising through the ranks of service to seize power? Or was he a usurper who needed a myth of humble beginnings to soften the violence of his ascent? The basket on the river motif may have been borrowed from older Mesopotamian traditions, later inspiring parallels in stories like that of Moses. Whatever its origins, the legend tells us less about what happened, and more about what people needed to believe. That the founder of the first great empire was more than mortal, marked by destiny. Once in power, Sargon reshaped the political landscape of Mesopotamia. Before him, the land was a patchwork of rival cities, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, each claiming supremacy, none able to hold it for long. Sargon changed that balance. Through conquest, he brought the fractious Sumerian city-states under one authority. forging a new political identity that would outlive him, the Akkadian Empire. He styled himself King of Akkad, but also bore grander titles, King of Kish, to root his authority in Sumerian tradition, and more ambitiously, King of the Four Quarters of the World. This phrase was not mere rhetoric. It was a statement of universal dominion, a claim that his reach extended to the very edges of the known earth. Under Sargon, armies marched north into Syria, west toward the Levant, and even into Anatolia. Trade routes opened that connected the Tigris and Euphrates to distant lands, bringing timber, metals, and precious stones. For the first time, Mesopotamia was not only a collection of cities, but the beating heart of a wide and interlinked empire. Central to Sargon's success were the innovations he introduced in governance. Unlike the kings before him, who relied on levies drawn from their cities in times of war, Sargon established a standing army, a permanent force loyal not to the city, but to the king himself. This professionalization of warfare gave him unprecedented reach and control. He stationed trusted governors, often Akkadians, over conquered cities, weaving local rulers into a centralized administration. With this system, he not only conquered but maintained, ensuring that rebellion could be swiftly crushed. The sheer scale of his reign also brought cultural transformation. Akkadian, a Semitic language, rose alongside Sumerian, creating a bilingual world where scribes recorded texts in both tongues. In time, Akkadian would eclipse Sumerian as the spoken language of the land, though the older tongue retained its prestige in scholarship and liturgy. In this way, Sargon's empire did not erase Sumer, but absorbed it, blending traditions in a synthesis that would echo for centuries. And yet, even in triumph, cracks appeared. The very scale of the empire that Sargon created demanded constant vigilance. Rebellions flared in the south, in Elam to the east, in Mari to the west. The legend says that Sargon faced uprisings in every city-state, and yet subdued them all. But whether this was fact or royal exaggeration is unclear. The larger the empire grew, the more it depended upon Sargon's personal charisma and military might. We do not know precisely how his reign ended. The records are fragmentary, the echoes faint. What we do know is that his legacy did not vanish with his death. He founded a dynasty, and his grandsons, most famously Naram-Sin, would expand and reshape the empire further. Sargon was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a model, the archetype of kingship as universal dominion. Later rulers across Mesopotamia, even in distant Assyria and Babylonia, would look back to his reign as the standard against which all others were measured. Yet the deeper question lingers. Who was Sargon? Truly, was he a gardener's foundling lifted by fate? A servant who seized the throne through ambition? A warrior blessed by the gods? Or a usurper who cloaked his conquest in myth? The fragments of his inscriptions give us glimpses, but no certainties. In one, he boasts of washing his weapons in the sea, a claim to have reached the limits of the world. In another, he declares that he knew no rival. The voice is commanding, but also self-fashioning, shaping the image of an invincible ruler. And so Sargon stands at the threshold between memory and myth. His empire was real. Its soldiers marched, its scribes wrote, its governors ruled. But the man at its center remains elusive. Was he remembered for what he did, or for the story others needed him to embody? In the reed basket upon the river lies the symbol of this uncertainty. A life set adrift, carried by currents we cannot see, destined to change the course of history. As the echoes of Sargon's reign fade into the deeper silence of time, we are left with the image of an empire builder whose shadow still looms over the ancient world. The rivers that once carried his legend continue to flow, whispering of a man who claimed the world, and of the unanswered question of whether he was chosen, or whether he chose himself. Chapter 11. The Naram-Sin Stele of Victory. In the hushed glow of a museum hall carved in pink limestone, there stands an image that still unsettles the gaze. The Stele of Naram-Sin, raised over 4,000 years ago, shows a king not merely as ruler, but as god. It is one of the most arresting monuments of Mesopotamian art, and one of the most controversial statements of kingship the ancient world had ever seen. Naram-Sin, grandson of the empire builder Sargon of Akkad, reigned in the late 23rd century BCE. His grandfather had forged the first empire known to history, binding Sumerian city-states and distant lands under the Akkadian banner. But Naram-Sin went further. He was not content to stand in the long line of mortal kings blessed by the gods. He dared to claim divinity for himself, crowning his head with horns, the unmistakable sign of a god in Mesopotamian tradition. The stele, discovered at Susa in present-day Iran after it was seized as war booty centuries later, depicts his triumph over the lullaby, mountain tribes from the Zagros. Its imagery is unlike the rigid, ordered panels of earlier Mesopotamian monuments. Here the scene is alive with motion and asymmetry. Naram-Sin strides upward along a steep mountain slope, his soldiers in close formation behind him, his enemies tumbling down in defeat. The king towers above all, his body larger, his posture commanding, his horned helmet gleaming. Above him, celestial symbols, stars or suns, shine approval from the heavens. It is a striking vision. For the first time in recorded Mesopotamian art, the king is shown not merely as servant of the gods, but as divine himself. Earlier rulers had always been careful. They stood humbly before their gods, or they invoked their authority through ritual. But here, Naram-Sin wears the horns. He does not bow. He climbs. This was a radical break in the language of kingship. To crown oneself with divinity was to step beyond accepted boundaries. The Akkadian king declared not only that he ruled by divine favor, but that he shared in the very essence of divinity. In doing so, he redefined what kingship could mean, and invited condemnation that would echo for centuries. For the Akkadians of his time, the message of the stele was unmistakable. Naram-Sin was no ordinary man. His victories were not just political achievements, but cosmic ones. The mountain slopes upon which he marched were both real geography and sacred metaphor. For in Mesopotamian cosmology, the mountain often symbolized the axis between heaven and earth. By climbing it, Naram-Sin was not only defeating his enemies, he was ascending into divine space. The defeated lullaby are shown in desperate contortions. One begs for mercy, arms outstretched in vain supplication. Others lie crushed beneath the Akkadian advance, their bodies twisted into the soil. The Akkadian soldiers march in disciplined ranks, unified under their leader. The visual language is stark. Chaos and barbarism are overcome by order, embodied in the divine king. And yet, the stele is more than propaganda of conquest. It is a statement of theology, inscribed in stone. Its vertical composition, the king striding toward the stars, suggests that victory itself was proof of godhood. Success in war was no longer only a gift of the gods. It was evidence that the king had become one. But this audacity would not be forgiven by later generations. Centuries after his reign, scribes writing in the Sumerian King List and other texts condemned Naram-Sin as arrogant, a ruler whose pride drew divine wrath. They told tales of his hubris, how he sacked the temple of Enlil at Nippur, how he defied the sacred order, and how the gods punished him by unleashing invasions that toppled his empire. In these narratives, Naram-Sin became a cautionary figure, the king who reached too high and fell. Archaeologists and historians today still debate where truth ends and propaganda begins. There is little evidence that Naram-Sin destroyed Enlil's temple, yet the legend persisted, written down centuries after his death. It may be that his claim to divinity was remembered with discomfort by scribes loyal to older traditions. In their retellings, his monument of victory became a monument of warning. The stele itself, however, refuses such condemnation. Its presence is confident, its message uncompromising. It presents a ruler who saw no boundary between man and God, who embodied the empire's might in his own body. It is art as ideology, and ideology as immortality. The choice of material only deepens this impression. Carved into limestone, the stele would have gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun, its images catching the light. Placed in a public space, it would have been a reminder to every subject and visitor. The king who ruled them was not only their lord, but their god. Even when carried away as plunder to distant Susa centuries later, it retained its aura, a trophy of both conquest and contested memory. For modern eyes, the stele offers more than an image of ancient power. It raises profound questions about the shifting boundaries of kingship. What compelled Naram-Sin to declare himself divine? Was it necessity, in the face of rebellion and instability, to project a power beyond challenge? Was it a reflection of Akkadian ambition, the logical next step after Sargon's universal conquest? Or was it personal, the vision of a man who saw himself elevated beyond all others? The silence of the centuries leaves no answer. We see only the carved figure, frozen in ascent, climbing eternally toward the heavens, while his enemies crumble beneath his feet. And so, the stele of Naram-Sin endures as both triumph and warning. To his contemporaries, it proclaimed a ruler who transcended mortality. To later ages, it embodied dangerous pride. To us, it is a relic of a world wrestling with the limits of power, where kings sought not only to govern men, but to join the gods themselves. In its towering figure and horned crown, we glimpse both the glory of Akkad and the shadows of its downfall, a reminder that every ascent leaves the question of how far one may climb before the heavens themselves resist. Chapter 12. The Gutian Interregnum. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed around the end of the 22nd century BCE, its fragments did not dissolve into silence. Instead, Mesopotamia entered what later scribes remembered as an age of disorder, a grim interlude between empires. The Gutian Interregnum, the tablets that survived from later dynasties, describe the Gutians as a scourge upon the land, a wandering people who poured down from the Zagros mountains and cast the fertile plains into disarray. They were called dragon spawn from the mountains, and the people who knew not agriculture, invaders who unseated kings and brought famine in their wake. But how much of this picture is memory, and how much is myth? The Sumerian King List speaks of a long stretch in which Gutian rulers held sway. Their names, often short, rough-sounding to Sumerian ears, are listed in succession, though they rarely appear in other contexts. For Mesopotamian scribes writing centuries later, these kings represented a rupture in the sacred order. They were not chosen by the gods of the cities, not raised in proper ritual. Their reigns were remembered as illegitimate, a cautionary tale written into history. What happens when kingship is stolen rather than bestowed? Archaeology, however, tells a quieter story. Few traces of the Gutians have been securely identified. They left no grand monuments, no elaborate inscriptions carved in stone. Their memory is carried not by their own voices, but by those of their enemies. Some scholars argue that this silence itself suggests a kind of truth. Perhaps the Gutians did not devastate the land, but their rule lacked the organized bureaucracy and literary culture of the Sumerians and Akkadians. Without scribes to record their victories, their presence slipped into shadow. The chronicles of Lagash and Ur describe the Gutians as uncivilized, incapable of tending fields or respecting temples. They are accused of letting irrigation canals fall into neglect, of plunging the people into hunger. Yet such descriptions may have been sharpened by political necessity. For the rulers who followed, men like Utu-Hagal of Uruk and Ur-Nammu of Ur, the memory of Gutian chaos became a powerful contrast. To present oneself as restorer of order, one needed to emphasize how deeply disorder had spread. The Gutians, whether guilty or not, became the canvas upon which later dynasties painted their legitimacy. Still, hints emerged that the Gutians were more than a destructive horde. Some rulers listed in the King List bear reign lengths that suggest stability rather than endless turmoil. At Adab, evidence points to continued urban life. Trade routes may have persisted, and in some regions, agricultural rhythms endured. If the Gutians were truly the ruin of Mesopotamian civilization, it is curious that cities revived so swiftly once they were expelled. Perhaps they governed lightly, content to draw tribute without weaving themselves into the fabric of local administration. The Gutian period also reveals the fragility of Mesopotamian kingship. The Akkadian Empire, vast in ambition, had bound cities together with military force and centralized power. When its structure crumbled, weakened by drought, internal rebellion, and external invasion, kingship itself appeared vulnerable. The gods, who were said to have once bestowed monarchy from heaven, seemed to allow it to fall into the hands of strangers. For the Sumerians, this was both a humiliation and a theological crisis. How could divine order be reconciled with years under barbarian rulers? Later scribes answered with condemnation. They told of Gutian rulers who were weak, cowardly, and cursed. They imagined their downfall as inevitable, as if divine justice demanded it. Utu-Hagal, the king of Uruk who drove them out, was remembered not simply as a warrior but as a savior. His inscriptions describe the Gutians as the snake of the mountains, whom he cast down with the help of the gods. Kingship, they declared, was restored to its rightful place, reborn in Sumer once more. And yet, beneath this narrative of chaos and redemption, questions remain. Who were the Gutians? Were they nomads pressed into Mesopotamia by shifting climates? Were they mercenaries once employed by Akkadian kings, who turned against their masters in the empire's decline? Or were they always present on the margins, watching for a moment of weakness to seize power? The truth lies blurred, half visible in the dust of texts and soil. The Gutians may have been both destroyers and rulers, both outsiders and inheritors of a fractured empire. Their silence in the archaeological record is not necessarily absence, but a reminder that history often remembers the victors more clearly than the vanquished. The Gutian interregnum thus endures as a shadowed chapter, where kingship itself seemed to falter. It is a reminder that monarchy in Mesopotamia was never secure, never beyond question. The divine gift of rule could be withdrawn, disrupted, even mocked by outsiders who wore the crown without reverence. And in the silence between empires, the memory of kings grew sharper, defined against the spectre of collapse. In this darkness, dynasties that followed found their light, yet the figure of the Gutian remains, vague, half-formed, accused, and unanswering, a ghost in Mesopotamian memory, forever challenging us to wonder what truly transpired in those years when the order of kings lay broken. Chapter 13. Gudea of Lagash. The long arc of Mesopotamian history, kings often stand before us as warriors and empire builders, men whose names were etched into memory through conquest and dominion. But in the city of Lagash, in the waning years of the 3rd millennium BCE, there emerged a ruler of a different kind. His name was Gudea, and his image endures not in scenes of battle, but in the quiet posture of devotion. His statues do not carry weapons raised for victory. Instead, they fold hands in prayer, their stillness radiating an aura of contemplation and service. In Gudea's reign, kingship was briefly reframed, not as divine conqueror, nor as despot, but as steward, mediator, and servant of the gods. Gudea ruled Lagash around 2140 BCE, a city that had already seen cycles of power, decline, and renewal. The Akkadian Empire had crumbled under internal strife and external incursions, leaving the once dominant landscape fractured. Lagash, nestled in the southern reaches of Sumer, seized the moment to reassert itself. Yet unlike Sargon or his grandson Naram-Sin, Gudea's ambitions were not cast outward in conquest. Instead, they were turned inward, toward the sacred life of the city, its temples, its rituals, and its delicate relationship with the divine. His legacy is preserved not in epic accounts of expansion, but in the black diorite statues, over 24 of them, that depict him seated or standing in eternal supplication. These statues, unearthed in temple precincts and now displayed in museums across the world, form one of the most striking testaments to an alternative vision of kingship in Mesopotamia. The choice of diorite itself speaks volumes. This volcanic stone, quarried from distant lands such as Magan, likely Oman, was among the hardest materials available to Mesopotamian artisans. Its durability was unmatched, resisting weather and time far more effectively than softer limestone or alabaster. By selecting diorite, Gudea ensured that his likeness would endure for millennia, outlasting the fragility of mud brick palaces and temple walls. The stone statues depict him with smooth, polished surfaces, hands clasped, gaze fixed in calm serenity. They show him not as a god, but as a man humbly devoted to the divine. Yet behind this humility lies an unmistakable message. Piety itself can be a form of power. Gudea's inscriptions, inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform, further illuminate his role. They speak less of conquests and more of temple building. Under his rule, the great temple of Ningirsu, the god of Lagash, was restored and glorified. He recounts dreams in which the gods themselves instructed him to build, visions where divine beings placed measuring rods and blueprints into his hands. In one famous cylinder inscription, Gudea describes how he purified himself before construction, abstaining from sex, fasting, and performing rituals of cleansing. The temple was to be built not merely of stone and timber, but of cosmic order, aligning human devotion with celestial will. In his words, kingship was less about ruling subjects than about aligning society with the divine pattern. And yet, the line between piety and propaganda was thin. While Gudea presents himself as humble servant, he was also consolidating power through devotion. By positioning himself as the chosen mediator of the gods, he reinforced his authority in ways just as potent as the military triumphs of Naram-Sin. The imagery of humility, the clasped hands, the bowed head, was itself a performance of kingship, one carefully crafted for audiences both human and divine. In this sense, Gudea's statues are not so different from Naram Sin's stele of victory. One glorified violence sanctified by divinity, the other glorified submission sanctified by piety. Both served the same end, to enshrine the ruler as indispensable. Archaeologists have long marveled at the contrast. The statues of Gudea, carved with exquisite precision, capture details of garment folds, muscular arms, and tranquil expressions. Some depict him seated, a ruler at rest, suggesting stability and permanence. Others show him standing, poised as if awaiting divine command. In several, inscriptions detail the materials used to build temples, the timbers brought from distant lands, the metals imported from Anatolia, the stones dragged across deserts. Lagash, under Gudea, was no isolated city, but a hub connected to far-reaching trade routes. His devotion to temple building was also a testament to the wealth and influence his rule commanded. What makes Gudea's reign especially intriguing is the way later traditions remembered him. While the Gutians were vilified as destroyers and Naram Sin condemned for hubris, Gudea was remembered as a model of righteousness. His inscriptions emphasized justice, order, and care for the gods, as if to present his reign as a kind of golden interlude amid the turbulence of Mesopotamia's political landscape. Yet historians must ask, was this memory itself curated? Did later scribes, weary of imperial hubris, elevate Gudea precisely because he stood as the antithesis of excess? In his statues, humility is frozen into stone, but humility, when eternalized, becomes its own monument to power. The diorite figures, now scattered across museums in Paris, London, and elsewhere, still carry an almost magnetic presence. To stand before one is to feel drawn into the gaze of a man who has been praying for over 4,000 years. His clasped hands never relax, his eyes never close, his devotion never ceases. They are reminders not only of one man's reign, but of a broader experiment in what kingship could mean. Could a king wield power through piety, just as effectively as through war? Could the language of humility itself become the strongest foundation for rule? Yet even here the silences are telling. We do not know the daily lives of his subjects, whether they truly experienced his reign as one of justice and harmony. We do not know how much of his piety was personal conviction, and how much was deliberate image-making. We see only what survives. The statues, the inscriptions, the carefully chosen words and poses. They speak to us across the centuries, but they speak in a voice that is crafted, curated, and never fully transparent. Gudea's reign represents a pendulum swing in the story of Mesopotamian kingship, away from divine hubris toward reverent stewardship. But the pendulum would not rest here. The centuries to follow would see new empires rise and fall, new kings claim divinity, new rulers shatter the balance of humility. Gudea's statues remain quiet and eternal, as though whispering a counterpoint to the louder voices of conquest and empire. And so, when we look upon the black diorite figures, we are left with questions that resist resolution. Was Gudea truly the humble servant he appeared to be? Or was humility itself his chosen mask of power? Were his temples offerings to the gods, or monuments to his own enduring presence? In the polished stone, in the folded hands, in the gaze that never breaks, we see both devotion and ambition, two faces of kingship fused into one. The silence of Gudea's statues lingers, unresolved, like a prayer that stretches across time, waiting for the next voice to answer. Chapter 14. The Third Dynasty of when the dust of Akkad's empire had settled, and the Gutian interlude faded into a chapter of disdain and shadow. A new dynasty arose on the southern plains of Mesopotamia. It was not the first time a city-state sought to bind Sumer and beyond under its hand, and it would not be the last. But for a time, just over a century, the kings of stood as the stewards of an era later remembered as a high point of order, justice, and grandeur. This period, known as the Third Dynasty of spanned from around 2112 to 2004 BCE. Its rulers, Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi above all, fashioned a vision of kingship that was at once ancient and startlingly new, deeply rooted in the divine mandate of Sumerian tradition, yet woven with innovations in administration, law, and culture. Situated near the marshlands at the mouth of the Euphrates, was already an ancient city by the time Ur-Nammu seized power. But under his reign, became the center of a resurgent order, a realm that reached far beyond the city's walls. Ur-Nammu consolidated control over much of Mesopotamia, harnessing both military strength and an intricate bureaucracy to manage diverse peoples. Yet what made his rule remarkable was not conquest alone, but the structure he imposed upon it. The careful crafting of kingship as the protector of justice, the enforcer of divine balance, and the master of the earthly order. Perhaps the most enduring testimony of Ur-Nammu's vision is his law code, an inscription predating Hammurabi's more famous code by centuries. Though only fragments survive, its spirit is clear. It sought not simply to impose punishment, but to establish justice as a divine mandate entrusted to the king. The prologue invokes the gods Inanna and Utu, deities of moon and sun, night and judgment, as the sources of authority. Ur-Nammu presented himself as their chosen instrument, bringing fairness to disputes, order to chaos, and measure to retribution. Theft, adultery, injury, all found their prescribed resolutions in its clauses. What survives suggests a system less severe than later Babylonian laws, leaning toward monetary compensation rather than mutilation. Through this code, the king stood as guarantor of equity, binding society together under the shared umbrella of law. Ur-Nammu also turned his vision toward the heavens, literally. Under his command rose the monumental ziggurats, stepped temple towers of baked brick that still rise from the soil of Uruk. The great ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Inanna, remains one of the most iconic relics of Mesopotamian civilization. Its massive terraces, once faced with shining baked bricks, would have dominated the skyline, a mountain of man-made stone ascending toward the realm of the gods. To climb its staircases was to ascend into sacred space, a ritualized journey linking earth to sky. For Ur-Nammu, these structures were not only offerings of devotion, but declarations of power, monuments that proclaimed the wealth, labor, and vision of his reign. When Ur-Nammu died, likely in battle, cut down before his ambitions could be fully realized, his son Shulgi inherited the throne. If Ur-Nammu was remembered as builder and lawgiver, Shulgi was remembered as something far more complex. A man who strove to embody kingship in its fullest, most dazzling form. His reign extended for nearly half a century, a length of rule rare in the ancient world. And during this time he reshaped the very image of what it meant to be king. Shulgi styled himself not only as ruler, but as poet, athlete, warrior, and priest. In inscriptions, he boasts of running long distances, of composing hymns, of mastering languages and wisdom traditions. He called himself the King of the Four Quarters, laying claim to a cosmic dominion, and he dared to edge closer to divinity than his father had. Like Naram-Sin before him, he claimed semi-divine status, suggesting that he was not merely chosen by the gods, but born of them. Hymns portray him as a radiant being, wise in judgment, strong in battle, beloved of deities. Yet beneath the splendor of his rhetoric, Shulgi was also a master of practical governance. He expanded his father's bureaucratic reforms, creating one of the most detailed administrative systems known in the ancient world. Clay tablets from the Ur-3 period, numbering in the tens of thousands, record everything from grain rations to workforce assignments, temple offerings to tax collections. They reveal a society where scribes were the lifeblood of order, where every transaction, every delivery, every allocation of labor was etched into clay. It was an empire of records, a kingdom that sought to tame chaos not only with walls and soldiers, but with writing and numbers. This administrative machine reached into every corner of daily life. Temples became centers of both worship and economy, managing lands and resources on behalf of the gods. Regional governors, loyal to Ur, oversaw distant territories, ensuring the flow of tribute and labor back to the capital. The system was hierarchical, but it was also astonishingly efficient, at least for a time. For ordinary people, it meant both stability and burden, a structured world where justice might be predictable, but where obligations to the state and its temples were relentless. Shulgi's cultural ambitions extended further still. He patronized literature, hymns, and scribal schools, cementing the Sumerian language as the sacred tongue of scholarship, even as Akkadian spread as the spoken language of empire. His hymns, some of which survive, present him as a king of unparalleled skill and wisdom. They are part praise, part propaganda, part attempt to eternalize his reign as a model of ideal kingship. Through words as much as stone, Shulgi sought immortality. Yet as with all Mesopotamian empires, fragility lay just beneath the surface. Despite its grandeur, the Ur III dynasty was constantly pressed by external threats. To the east, the Elamites loomed, a perennial rival across the Zagros Mountains. To the west and north, Amorite tribes edged into Mesopotamia, testing its borders and stability. The very administrative system that sustained Ur's control also carried seeds of vulnerability. Its vast bureaucracy was costly to maintain, and the constant demands for tribute and labor could strain loyalty among subject peoples. After Shulgi's long reign, his successors faced increasing pressures. Internal dissent, external invasions, and economic strains converged. By the early 2000s BCE, the Elamites struck decisively. In 2004 BCE, Ur itself was sacked, its temples desecrated, its ziggurat burned, and its dynasty brought to an abrupt end. The dream of a unified Sumer under Ur's kings had collapsed, leaving behind ruins and laments. Indeed, the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, a Sumerian poem preserved on clay tablets, captures the devastation in haunting tones. It portrays the fall of Ur not as mere political defeat, but as cosmic catastrophe, the gods themselves abandoning the city to ruin. And yet, even in its collapse, the third dynasty of Ur left behind an enduring vision of kingship. Ur-Nammu's law code foreshadowed later legal traditions. His ziggurats became templates for sacred architecture across Mesopotamia. Shulgi's hymns and reforms embedded the image of a king as both earthly ruler and cosmic mediator. Their century of rule, though brief in the long measure of history, crystallized a model of monarchy that would echo through Babylonian, Assyrian, and beyond. To walk among the ruins of Ur today is to sense both the grandeur and the fragility of that vision. The ziggurat, partially restored, still rises from the desert plain, its stairways leading nowhere, its summit open to the sky. It stands as a reminder of kings who once dreamed of bridging earth and heaven, who sought to enshrine justice, law, poetry, and power into one seamless whole. But the silence around it whispers of impermanence, of dynasties undone, of visions shattered by time. The third dynasty of Ur shone brightly, like the gleam of sun on polished brick, for a century. And then, as always in Mesopotamia's long cycle, the light dimmed, leaving memory, fragments, and questions. Was it the height of Sumerian kingship, or merely another fragile dream, destined to crumble under the weight of ambition and fate? The answer lingers in the ruins, unresolved, as the story of kingship moves forward into yet another age. Chapter 15. The law code of Ur-Nammu around the turn of the 21st century before our era, in the heart of southern Mesopotamia, a king sought to write justice into clay. Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, ordered the inscribing of laws upon tablets, setting down rules not only for his officials and judges, but for the entire structure of society over which he ruled. These fragments, preserved by the brittle resilience of fired earth, are among the earliest known examples of written law. They speak to us across 4,000 years, whispering of a time when kingship was not measured only in conquest and monuments, but also in the attempt to give order to human life through principles of fairness. The surviving tablets date to around 2100 BCE, though they are incomplete, shattered pieces gathered from the ruins of Nippur, Ur, and other cities. They present a prologue, a series of legal clauses, and a conclusion. In the prologue, Ur-Nammu is depicted as the chosen of the gods, particularly Inanna, the moon god of Ur, and Utu, the sun god of justice. By invoking divine authority, he framed his laws as more than human invention. They were portrayed as the very will of heaven translated into earthly decree, the king acting as the mediator between the divine order and the daily struggles of his people. The clauses themselves are remarkable for their tone. Unlike the later and more famous laws of Hammurabi, which often prescribed harsh physical punishments, Ur-Nammu's code leaned toward compensation. If a man caused injury, he was to pay silver. If he destroyed property, restitution was required. Even in cases of serious wrongdoing, the emphasis was often on restoring balance through payment, rather than escalating violence through mutilation. Only in matters of grave offense, such as murder or certain forms of sexual violence, do we find references to capital punishment. The spirit of the code seems guided by the idea of reparation, of returning the social fabric to harmony rather than tearing it further apart. This approach raises questions. Was Ur-Nammu's code truly applied across his realm, guiding judges and scribes in everyday disputes? Or was it more symbolic, a declaration of ideals carved into clay as a demonstration of the king's piety and wisdom, but not necessarily enforced in every case? Scholars debate this still. The fragmentary nature of the tablets leaves us uncertain. What survives is only a glimpse, not the whole. Yet even fragments reveal intent. Ur-Nammu wished to be remembered not only as builder of ziggurats and conqueror of lands, but as lawgiver, an image that connected him to the very essence of Mesopotamian kingship. For in Sumerian thought, law was never merely human, it was cosmic. The gods had established me, the divine decrees, which ordered every aspect of life, from kingship and agriculture to ritual and music. To create a law code was to align the kingdom with these eternal decrees, to bring society into harmony with the fabric of the cosmos. By issuing his code, Ur-Nammu proclaimed himself as the guardian of this balance, the earthly hand shaping human affairs in accord with divine pattern. Justice was not simply practical administration, it was sacred duty. The language of the code reflects this. It is not the language of cold governance, but of moral order. In the prologue, Ur-Nammu declares that he established equity in the land. He describes protecting the orphan and the widow, preventing the strong from oppressing the weak, and ensuring that justice reached even the most vulnerable. Whether these declarations were fully realized in practice remains uncertain, but the intention is clear. The image of the king as defender of the powerless was enshrined in the very opening lines. One might wonder why such a code emerged at this time, in this place. The third dynasty of Ur was a moment of renewed centralization after centuries of political flux. Ur-Nammu sought to bind together diverse peoples under his rule. Temples, bureaucracies, armies, and roads all served this purpose. But law, inscribed and publicly proclaimed, offered something different. A unifying vision of justice, a shared framework that transcended city walls. It is possible that these laws served not only practical governance, but also propaganda, legitimizing his reign in the eyes of subjects and rivals alike. Archaeologically, the fragments we possess do not allow us to reconstruct the entire code. We know it contained at least 30 clauses, perhaps more. Some survive intact. If a man divorced his wife, he was to pay her compensation in silver. If someone cut off another's foot, they owed 10 shekels. If a slave said to his master, "You are not my master," the slave's ear was cut off. Here we see both leniency and severity. The code was not free of violence, but it tempered it with restitution, a pattern reflecting both the complexities of justice and the demands of hierarchy. The contrast with Hammurabi's later code is striking. By the time Hammurabi ruled Babylon, 3 centuries later, the punishments had become more rigid, more brutal, and often tied explicitly to social rank. Ur-Nammu's code, in comparison, seems gentler, though no less hierarchical. It offers us a glimpse into an earlier legal imagination, one where justice was more restorative than retributive. Yet we must remember, our view is partial, shaped by the accidents of survival, the cracks in clay, the silences of time. Still, the symbolic power of Ur-Nammu's code cannot be overstated. It is one of the earliest surviving attempts to write justice into permanence, to move beyond oral tradition and ad hoc judgment. By inscribing his laws, Ur-Nammu created a standard that could, in theory, outlast his own reign. The tablets suggest a world in which kingship itself was evolving, not merely about military might or divine favor, but about structuring society in accordance with higher principles. And yet, there lingers a mystery. Was Ur-Nammu remembered as a true lawgiver in the living memory of his people, or was the image crafted for posterity? Did widows and orphans actually feel the shelter of his justice, or was this merely the rhetoric of kingship, etched into stone to echo across the ages? The truth may be forever obscured, lost in the silence of clay fragments and half-remembered lines. What endures is the vision, a king kneeling before the gods, receiving their command to establish fairness on earth, a ruler who sought not only to build monuments of brick, but monuments of justice, carved into words. The tablets of Ur-Nammu do not give us certainty, but they give us a glimpse into how monarchy in the ancient world sought to clothe itself in the mantle of divine law. And so, the law code of Ur-Nammu stands as both beginning and question. It begins a tradition that would shape Mesopotamia and beyond, echoed in Hammurabi, echoed in the Hebrew Bible, echoed in the legal codes that followed. but it also leaves us questioning how much of what was written was real and how much was ideal. In the quiet halls of museums, where these fragments now rest, their lines are faint but enduring. They remind us that long before the modern world debated justice, fairness, and law, a king on the banks of the Euphrates imagined a society bound by principles, guided by the will of the gods, and etched forever into clay. Whether those laws were lived or merely dreamed, they remain, like the ziggurats of as testaments to humanity's ancient longing for order, fairness, and meaning. Softly, we are left with the question, were these the first true laws or the first royal promises? The clay does not answer, it only endures. Chapter 16. The ziggurat of Uruk, the flat expanses of southern Mesopotamia, where the horizon stretches unbroken and the sun sinks in a haze of dust. One form still rises above the earth like a memory etched into stone. It is not a natural hill or a mountain formed by time. It is a mountain of human hands, raised deliberately from mud, clay, and vision. The great ziggurat of commissioned by King Ur-Nammu at the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE. This towering structure remains one of the most enduring monuments of ancient Mesopotamia. Its stepped platforms once climbed toward the heavens, tier upon tier, declaring in their geometry the ancient union of heaven and earth. Where most dwellings of that age have long since dissolved back into dust, this structure still endures. Its survival is itself a testament, not only to its scale and engineering, but to the symbolic weight it carried, a visible axis, an artificial mountain where gods and men might meet. Ur-Nammu, who reigned from around 2112 to 2095 BCE, understood kingship as more than administration and conquest. His legacy lies in the forging of law, in the ordering of society, and in the raising of sacred foundations that would bind his reign to eternity. Among his most celebrated achievements stands this ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Inanna, patron deity of Ur. For in the belief of the Sumerians, every city was watched over by a divine guardian, and the temple was no mere place of worship. It was the god's earthly dwelling. The ziggurat, towering above the plain, marked the cosmic center of the city and the heart of its identity. Constructed from sun-dried mud brick at its core, bound by bitumen and faced with kiln-fired brick, the ziggurat was built to endure. Archaeologists believe it rose in 3 grand tiers, though inscriptions hint it may once have been crowned by a gleaming shrine, clad in bright metals or glazed tiles that caught the light of the sun. Its stairways ascended steeply, drawing the gaze upward, compelling every visitor to imagine the climb, not just of steps, but of worlds. The lower earth of men, the middle air of spirits, and the higher realm of the gods. The building of the ziggurat was not simply an architectural act. In the royal inscriptions, Ur-Nammu proclaims himself as chosen by the gods to restore order and bring divine harmony. The ziggurat was presented as a sacred duty, the binding of heaven and earth. Its erection was a form of cosmic stewardship, reinforcing the king's role not merely as ruler of people, but as mediator between mortal and divine. Each brick, set in place by the king's command, was believed to participate in this act of binding. To construct the ziggurat was to realign the cosmos itself, yet the monument was also deeply political. In commissioning such a structure, Ur-Nammu inscribed his reign into the very landscape. The ziggurat announced, to every rival city and every subject, that Ur was the seat of divine order, the dwelling place of Inanna, and the axis through which heaven itself was bound to earth. To climb its steps was to acknowledge Ur's supremacy, to recognize the king's authority as divinely sanctioned. The act of devotion was inseparable from the acceptance of power. Even in ruin, the ziggurat of Ur commands reverence. Archaeological excavations led by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s revealed its immense foundations and the monumental staircases that once bore the feet of priests and kings. What Woolley uncovered was not only an architectural marvel, but a vision of kingship preserved in brick. The ziggurat, like the law code of Ur-Nammu, framed rule as a sacred covenant, a balance between divine mandate and earthly order. But there are mysteries woven into its bricks. How much of the structure visible today reflects its original form, and how much is the result of later reconstructions? The ziggurat was restored and rebuilt multiple times, by kings long after Ur-Nammu, most notably by Nabonidus of Babylon, 1,000 years later. Each ruler inscribed himself upon the same monument, layering memory upon memory, so that what stands today is not a single moment frozen in time, but a palimpsest of power. Was the original shrine atop the ziggurat clad in shining copper, as some fragments suggest, reflecting the moonlight of Nanna across the city? Or was it adorned with coloured tiles, blue as the heavens, green as fertile fields, red as fire? Archaeology has yet to resolve these details, leaving only fragments of speculation, shadows of lost splendour. There are further silences. Did ordinary citizens ascend the staircases, or were they reserved for priests and kings? Was the shrine open to the people, or did it serve as the god's private chamber, seen only by intermediaries? We may never know how the ziggurat functioned in the rhythm of daily devotion. What we do know is that it dominated the skyline, casting its shadow over fields and houses, marking time not by hours, but by its immovable presence. For those who lived in the ziggurat was not an abstract symbol. It was the mountain of their city, the center of their world, the unshakable proof that the gods were near. In the centuries after Ur-Nammu, the ziggurat endured even as dynasties rose and fell. The third dynasty of Ur collapsed under Elamite invasion. The city was plundered, the empire dissolved into fragments. Yet the ziggurat remained, weathering the turning of ages, its bricks crumbling but its outlines still unmistakable. Even conquerors could not erase it fully. In its persistence, we glimpse the deeper truth. Monuments are not simply for those who build them, but for those who come after. Today, visitors to southern Iraq still see its massive bulk rising above the desert plain. Restored in part in the 20th century, its stairways once again climb skyward, though the shrine above is long gone. Standing before it, one feels the same pull of the horizon that ancient citizens must have felt. The sense that here was the meeting place of heaven and earth. And yet, for all that survives, what is absent is equally powerful. The chants of the priests, the scent of incense, the solemn processions ascending the steps, these are lost. The voices that once filled the shrine of Nanna are silent, leaving only the hushed imagination of what once was. The ziggurat speaks most loudly in its silence, a reminder that what kings sought to eternalize in brick was still subject to time's erosion. In this ruin, we sense both ambition and fragility. The ziggurat was meant as a bridge to eternity, a mountain of permanence in a land of shifting rivers and fragile clay. Yet eternity too is layered and unstable, reconstructed by each generation that remembers or forgets. Ur-Nammu's vision still rises, but altered, eroded, reinterpreted. What remains is a shadow of what once was, and perhaps that was always the fate of monuments, to be remembered less for their fullness than for the mysteries they leave behind. And so, as the desert wind moves across the weathered bricks of Ur, one feels both presence and absence, the weight of what was, and the haunting question of what can never be fully recovered. In that tension, the ziggurat still fulfills its ancient role. It is a bridge, not only between gods and men, but between past and present, between what is known and what forever escapes us. Chapter 17. The Amorite Ascendancy and Isin-Larsa period. When the great ziggurat of Ur still towered above the Mesopotamian plain, the empire that had raised it was already in decline. Around 2004 BCE, the third dynasty of Ur fell beneath the weight of external invasions and internal fractures. Elamite forces swept in from the east, and the once centralized power of Ur dissolved almost overnight. What followed was not silence, but a new and turbulent chapter, a landscape of shifting dynasties, contested thrones, and competing visions of kingship. It is in this crucible of uncertainty that the Amorite ascendancy and the age of Isin and Larsa were forged. The collapse of Ur left a vacuum. In its wake, city-states that had once been bound beneath the Sumerian crown reclaimed autonomy. Chief among these were Isin and Larsa, two rival centers that rose from the fragments of empire. Each claimed not only political power, but the sacred inheritance of Ur's legacy. The kings of Isin, beginning with Ishbi-Era, positioned themselves as guardians of continuity, invoking the memory of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, aligning themselves with ancient traditions of temple building, law-giving, and cosmic order. For them, legitimacy was not only military, but ritual, a performance of stability in a fractured land. Yet the age was not defined by continuity alone. Into the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia came waves of Amorite clans, semi-nomadic groups from the western deserts, long seen as outsiders by the urban elites of Sumer. At first, the Amorites were mercenaries, traders, and pastoralists at the edges of society. But in the centuries after Ur's fall, they entered the very heart of Mesopotamian power. Some took on kingship in the cities. Others blended their tribal traditions of chieftain leadership with the enduring models of Sumerian monarchy. In their rise, kingship itself began to transform. The Amorite rulers brought with them new modes of rule, shaped by mobility, kinship bonds, and martial strength, while still clothing themselves in the garments of ancient Sumerian ritual. Archaeological evidence reflects this fusion. Inscriptions from Isin declare temple restorations dedicated to the gods of old, but the names of the kings themselves reveal Amorite lineage. The dialects preserved in tablets show the mixing of Akkadian and Sumerian traditions. Administrative records indicate that the bureaucracy of Ur, once a vast and centralized machine, was now localized and adapted, flexible to the needs of competing dynasties. Kings, such as Lipit Ishtar of Isin, issued law codes in the model of Ur-Nammu, preserving the notion of divine justice, yet inflecting it with their own dynastic authority. Here, we see a delicate balance, an assertion of innovation wrapped carefully in the language of continuity. But where Isin emphasized legitimacy through Ur's memory, Larsa rose as a counterforce. By the 19th century BCE, under rulers like Gungunum and Rimsin, Larsa extended its influence across southern Mesopotamia. Its kings rivaled Isin in temple patronage, in the issuing of inscriptions, in the invocation of divine favor. Yet the rivalry was not merely symbolic. Armies clashed, alliances shifted, and for generations the balance of power teetered back and forth between these two poles. To walk the cities of Mesopotamia in this period was to live in a landscape of contested loyalties, where each king proclaimed himself heir to divine order, while every rival made the same claim. The Amorite ascendancy was not only political, it was cultural. In their rule, we begin to see the seeds of what would later blossom into Babylonian identity. Kingship was no longer the sole inheritance of Sumer. It was a mantle that could be worn by those who came from beyond the Tigris and Euphrates, provided they clothed themselves in the rights of the land. This was an age of blending, where tribal leaders became temple builders, and where urban scribes recorded new myths and genealogies that stitched Amorite kings into the long tapestry of Mesopotamian memory. Archaeologists and historians have long debated how deeply the Amorites transformed society, or whether they merely adopted the structures that preceded them. Some argue that the Amorite influx fractured older traditions, replacing the rigid hierarchies of Ur with looser clan-based systems of authority. Others suggest the opposite, that the Amorites were absorbed into the long continuity of Mesopotamian kingship, their distinctiveness soon erased by the enduring weight of Sumerian culture. Perhaps both views are true. The evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests a dialogue between traditions, a negotiation of identity that reshaped kingship without ever discarding the past. In this liminal space between collapse and renewal, myth and memory also played their part. Kings of the Isin-Larsa period invoked the gods with fervor, presenting themselves as chosen mediators who restored what had been broken. In their inscriptions, we hear echoes of earlier ages, but also a subtle shift. The king was no longer merely the steward of the god's city. He was the restorer of order after chaos, the one who claimed legitimacy by mending what had been lost. In this way, the trauma of Ur's fall became a narrative resource. To rule was to claim that one had healed the fracture. To conquer was to say one had brought back divine favor. The struggle between Isin and Larsa endured for generations, but by the early 18th century BCE, Larsa began to dominate. Rimsin I, in particular, expanded his control across much of southern Mesopotamia, uniting lands once scattered. Yet even as he consolidated power, the Amorite dynasty of Babylon was beginning to rise further north, under rulers whose ambitions would soon eclipse both Isin and Larsa. The rivalry that had defined a century was only a prelude to the next great transformation, the ascendancy of Babylon and the legendary reign of Hammurabi. And so the Isin-Larsa period stands as a threshold in Mesopotamian history. It was an age of fracture, but also of reinvention. Kings clothed themselves in ancient traditions while carrying new bloodlines. Temples rose again, but under the patronage of foreign names, the ziggurats still anchored cities. Yet the voices chanting within them were no longer the same as those of Shulgi's age. In this tension between continuity and change, we glimpse the resilience of Mesopotamian kingship, its ability to adapt, to absorb, to survive through reinvention. Even now, as archaeologists unearth tablets from this period, we find traces of uncertainty. Records of shifting dynasties, legal disputes, temple offerings, all preserved in clay, yet incomplete. The story of the Amorite ascendancy remains broken, like the fragments of tablets pieced together in museum drawers. What survives is enough to outline a transformation, but never enough to capture it fully. The silence between the lines is as telling as the words themselves. Standing among the ruins of Isin or the weathered remains of Lhasa, one feels both continuity and disjunction. The land remembers, but imperfectly. The ziggurats are reduced to mounds, the palaces to scattered foundations. Yet the memory of kingship lingers, woven into inscriptions, etched into broken tablets, whispered in the competing claims of dynasties long gone. And in that memory lies the deeper question. Was this age a twilight of Sumer or a dawn of something new? Was the Amorite ascendancy a rupture or a bridge to Babylonian greatness? The evidence offers no clear answer. It leaves us instead with an image of rival kings building temples to forgotten gods, of tribal leaders recast as monarchs, of ancient traditions surviving by changing shape. An age of fracture, but also of preparation. An age where kingship was tested, and where, in the shifting sands of power, the foundations of a new empire were quietly being laid. Chapter 18. Hammurabi and the Babylonian Consolidation. The world into which Hammurabi was born was one of shifting loyalties, fragile alliances, and constant rivalry. The great dynasties of Isin and Lhasa had spent generations vying for supremacy in the south, while in the north, small Amorite kingdoms pressed against one another like tectonic plates. Babylon, though destined to become a name that echoed across history, began this age as little more than a modest city-state, scarcely distinguishable from its neighbors. Yet from this unassuming beginning, Hammurabi, who reigned between 1792 and 1750 BCE, would craft a vision of kingship that still lingers in memory, preserved not only in stone and clay, but in the imagination of the world. Hammurabi's reign stretched across more than 4 decades, and in those years he proved himself a master of both war and diplomacy. Early in his kingship, Babylon was a regional power hemmed in by rivals stronger than itself. Hammurabi moved carefully, forging alliances when necessary, presenting himself as a loyal partner to those he would later supplant. At times, his diplomacy was cloaked in ritual language, affirming bonds under the watchful eyes of the gods. At other times, it was pragmatic, marked by the shifting convenience of treaties. He built slowly, but deliberately, and by the midpoint of his reign, the delicate web of power that bound Mesopotamia began to unravel under his hand. His military campaigns were decisive. Hammurabi struck first against Elam, that ancient rival from the east, whose power had destabilized Mesopotamia since the fall of Ur. With Elam checked, he turned his armies against Lhasa, the southern power that had once rivaled Isin for dominance. The defeat of Rim-Sin of Lhasa brought the fertile southern cities under Babylon's control. To the north and west, Hammurabi subdued Mari, whose palaces, later uncovered by archaeologists, revealed a dazzling record of correspondence and administration. Letters written in cuneiform that preserved not only the affairs of kings, but also the anxieties and ambitions of the age. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi's banners stretched from the Persian Gulf to the edges of Syria, and Babylon, once obscure, stood at the center of Mesopotamian life. Yet Hammurabi's genius lay not only in conquest, but in the vision of order he crafted. Unlike the warlords who came before him, Hammurabi sought to enshrine his authority in a form that outlasted the clash of arms. His name became forever tied to law. On a tall block of basalt, over 2 meters high, Hammurabi had his decrees inscribed in careful cuneiform. At its summit, a carved relief depicts the king standing humbly before Shamash, the radiant sun god of justice. From the god's hand flows the staff and ring of authority, symbols of divine sanction. The message is unmistakable. Hammurabi does not invent the law. He receives it, channeling divine will into earthly justice. The law code of Hammurabi, though not the first of its kind, was the most ambitious and enduring. It contained nearly 300 provisions, touching on every aspect of daily life: trade and debt, property and inheritance, marriage and divorce, crime and punishment. Its principles were not abstract philosophy, but practical governance. Merchants, farmers, builders, and priests alike were bound by its clauses. A builder whose poorly made house collapsed and killed its owner was to be put to death. A thief caught stealing was to face restitution or harsher penalties depending on his crime. The famous principle of an eye for an eye is found here, but it is not universal. It is mediated by social rank. The penalties differed depending on whether the victim was noble, commoner, or slave. Justice, in Hammurabi's vision, was ordered but not equal, reflecting the stratified society he ruled. Yet behind the severity of its punishments lies another emphasis: compensation and regulation. Many of its laws aimed not at vengeance, but at ensuring balance. Debts forgiven after crop failures, obligations clearly defined between landlord and tenant, penalties set for fraud or negligence. In this sense, Hammurabi's law code is less a catalogue of cruelty and more a charter for stability, designed to weave the complexities of Mesopotamian life into a fabric held together by royal authority. For archaeologists and historians, the survival of this stele is almost miraculous. Discovered at Susa in 1901, far from Babylon itself, it had been carried off as plunder by Elamite conquerors centuries after Hammurabi's time. Its theft ensured its preservation. When French archaeologists unearthed it, they found not only a monument to one king's ambition, but a window into an entire age. The black stone gleams even now with the power of a monarch who sought to legislate eternity. But was Hammurabi's code truly a lived reality, or more a symbolic declaration? This remains a matter of debate. Clay tablets from the Old Babylonian period reveal legal disputes and contracts, many of which align with the principles enshrined on the stele. Yet others diverge, suggesting that the code was less a binding constitution and more a statement of ideals. It may have functioned as a proclamation of the king's justice, a visible reminder set in temples that Hammurabi was the shepherd of his people and executor of divine order. Whether enforced to the letter or not, the stele itself carried weight. Its imagery spoke to the imagination, shaping the way people conceived kingship and law. In Hammurabi's consolidation of Babylon, we see both culmination and fragility. He forged unity across Mesopotamia, but it was a unity bound to his person. After his death in 1750 BCE, his empire began to unravel. Successors struggled to maintain the vast territory, facing renewed pressures from rising powers such as the Kassites and Hittites. Within a generation, the great Babylonian empire of Hammurabi was fractured, its dominance a memory. This was the paradox of Mesopotamian kingship. The higher it soared, the more fragile its foundations. And yet, Hammurabi's legacy endured in ways more subtle than empire. His code, replicated and remembered, shaped the legal consciousness of the Near East for centuries. Later rulers, from the Assyrians to the Persians, would cast themselves in the role of lawgivers, echoing the image of a king receiving authority from the gods. Even in the biblical tradition, scholars detect resonances of Hammurabi's principles carried across cultures and centuries. His empire crumbled, but his vision of kingship, as the divine executor of justice, outlasted the walls of Babylon itself. Standing before the stele in a museum today, one feels its weight not merely as stone, but as testimony. The carved image of Hammurabi bowing before Shamash is both humble and audacious. Humble in its recognition of divine source, audacious in its claim to embody that divine will. The laws inscribed below are both archaic and familiar, echoing concerns that still define societies: crime, debt, family, fairness, punishment. And yet, for all its clarity, the monument also conceals. How fully did Hammurabi's subjects believe in the justice proclaimed upon that basalt surface? Did they see in him a shepherd, or a conqueror cloaked in sacred language? Was his law an instrument of fairness, or another mask of control? The fragments of clay that survive suggest answers, but never fully. In the end, Hammurabi's reign was not the final word on Mesopotamian kingship, but one cycle in a pattern as old as the land itself. Rise and fall, unification and fracture, ambition and collapse. The rhythm repeats, each age recasting kingship anew. Hammurabi's empire flickered like a great flame, bright but brief, yet the shadow of his law still stretches across the centuries. And as we leave his age behind, the question lingers in the dust of Babylon's ruins. Was Hammurabi the culmination of Mesopotamian kingship, or simply another voice in the eternal chorus of rise and fall? each king reaching for eternity, each undone by the very fragility of power. Chapter 19. The Stele of Hammurabi, it rises from the earth like a monolith of command, black, unyielding, and inscribed with the will of a king who sought to bind his world in order. The Stele of Hammurabi, carved from solid diorite, stands over 7 feet tall, its polished surface still bearing the marks of a message intended for eternity. To stand before it is to confront both the grandeur and fragility of ancient power. It is not merely a stone, it is a proclamation, a declaration, and a testimony that the authority of one man was inseparable from the justice of the gods. At its crown, frozen in a timeless scene, Hammurabi himself is depicted standing in reverence before Shamash, the radiant sun god and divine judge. Shamash extends to him the rod and ring, symbols of authority, measuring instruments of justice, tokens of kingship's divine legitimacy. This image was no idle decoration. It was a statement as potent as the words that followed beneath it, that Hammurabi did not rule by chance or by conquest alone, but by sacred right granted from the celestial order itself. The body of the stele is dense with cuneiform, nearly 4,000 lines etched meticulously into the hard black surface. These inscriptions form what has come to be known as Hammurabi's Code, though to call it merely a set of laws is to understate its intent. It was not simply a rulebook for daily disputes. It was a vision of society itself, one where the duties of king and subject alike were bound by justice and divine expectation. From property rights and trade to marriage, theft and punishment, the code reached into every layer of life. Its tone was declarative, even paternal. The king had set forth order, and all who dwelled under his dominion were now woven into this great design. But laws in the ancient world were not cold documents. They were embodiments of cosmic order. In Mesopotamian thought, chaos always threatened at the edges: famine, flood, invasion, betrayal. Hammurabi's inscriptions were both shield and sword against that darkness. By declaring in stone that the strong may not oppress the weak, the king cast himself as guardian of the vulnerable, widows, orphans, the poor, the powerless. Whether such protection was fully realized in practice is another question. What mattered was that the king's voice, sanctified by Shamash, promised it. The survival of the stele itself is nearly as remarkable as its creation. For centuries it stood in Babylon, a monument to royal justice. Yet the course of history is rarely kind to symbols of empire. At some point, it was seized, carried far from its birthplace, and brought to the city of Susa in Elam, modern-day Iran. There, it was likely displayed as a trophy, the authority of Hammurabi repurposed by those who had conquered his heirs. Conquest had stripped the monument of its Babylonian context, but its symbolism endured, its words remaining legible long after the kings who claimed them were dust. It was in Susa, in 1901, that French archaeologists uncovered the stele once more. Buried, broken in places, but still commanding in its presence, it had traveled across empires and epochs to stand once again before human eyes. Its discovery was not just an archaeological triumph, it was a return of voice. After more than 3,000 years, Hammurabi's proclamations could once again be read, his image once again contemplated. In its survival, the stele revealed that even conquest could not silence the ambitions of kingship to speak across time. And yet, the question lingers. Why was this stone preserved when so many others were lost? Was it chance alone that allowed this monument to endure, while countless tablets crumbled to dust, temples sank beneath sand, and entire libraries burned in forgotten wars? Or does its endurance speak to something deeper? That the image of king and god, bound together in law, held meaning even to those who stole it from its home. Perhaps the conquerors of Susa did not destroy the stele because, in some sense, they too recognized the universality of what it embodied, the eternal dance of authority, justice, and divine sanction. What is most striking is that Hammurabi's stele was not unique in form. Other Mesopotamian kings issued decrees, some inscribed, others proclaimed orally, but none have reached us with such scale, preservation, and clarity. It is as if this single monument was chosen to carry the message of kingship forward, a solitary survivor that would outlast palaces, armies, and dynasties. Its presence in modern museums has made it one of the most iconic artifacts of the ancient world, reproduced, studied, and debated endlessly. Scholars continue to analyze its contents, Some argue that it was less a functional code and more a royal manifesto, a statement of ideology rather than a manual for judges. Few courts, after all, could consult a massive stone stele for every dispute. More likely, its presence was symbolic. A public demonstration that justice had been fixed, eternal, carved into the very bones of the earth. It was the idea of law, unshakable and divine, that mattered most. The stele also raises questions about kingship itself. Did Hammurabi see himself as the final culmination of Mesopotamian monarchy, the perfect synthesis of power and justice? Or was his vision no more lasting than those who came before him, Ur-Nammu, Gudea, Sargon? The fragility of his empire, which fractured soon after his death, suggests that the permanence of law was far greater than the permanence of conquest. The words endured, the throne did not, yet here lies the paradox. The stele proclaims unbreakable justice, yet its physical journey tells of impermanence, carried away as spoil, reinterpreted by new masters, buried and forgotten. In this duality, we glimpse the nature of kingship itself, always striving for the eternal, always at risk of erasure. When one stands before the stele of Hammurabi today, the weight of its presence is palpable. The polished black stone, the elegant cuneiform, the solemn image of king and god, it demands stillness, contemplation. It is as though Hammurabi still speaks, his voice echoing across nearly 4 millennia, reminding us that the pursuit of justice was once etched into stone as a covenant between ruler, people, and the divine, and yet the stele remains unresolved in its meaning. Was its survival a mere accident, the luck of archaeology? Or was it part of a larger continuity, a thread that kingship itself has carried through the ages? A reminder that order, once inscribed, seeks always to endure, even when empires fall. The questions linger in the silence, as if the black stone itself holds answers it will never release. Chapter 20. Mari and the letters of Zimri Lim, from the banks of the Euphrates, where the desert meets the slow, silvery current of the river, rose a city of immense splendor. Mari, a city whose name once carried the weight of diplomacy and power, flourished as a crossroads of Mesopotamian civilization. For centuries it stood as a bridge between Sumer and Akkad to the south, and the lands of Syria and Anatolia to the north and west. At its height, Mari was not merely a fortress or a trading hub. It was a stage where kings wove alliances, received emissaries, and enacted rituals that joined the human and the divine. At the heart of Mari lay its palace, a sprawling labyrinth of more than 260 rooms and courtyards. Archaeologists who first uncovered its remains in the 1930s marveled at its scale. Painted walls glowed with images of processions, gods, and kings. Storerooms overflowed with luxury goods, while archives concealed beneath the rubble held thousands of clay tablets. This palace was not only the dwelling of a monarch, but the very nerve center of a kingdom. It was here, within its chambers, that King Zimri Lim reigned in the early 18th century BCE, and it was here that his voice, and the voices of his court, were preserved in an archive unlike any other. When French archaeologist André Parrot first broke open the ruins of Mari, he could not have known the scale of what lay hidden. More than 20,000 cuneiform tablets emerged, most of them letters, an unfiltered correspondence between rulers, governors, generals, priests, and even family members. They spoke of trade and tribute, of omens and dreams, of the smallest details and the grandest decisions. For the first time, historians could step inside the daily machinery of kingship in Mesopotamia, not as it was idealized on monuments, but as it was lived. In these letters, Zimri Lim appears not as an untouchable figure of divine authority, but as a man burdened by the responsibilities of rule. His scribes recorded reports from governors on the movements of enemy troops, the loyalty of vassals, and the scarcity of grain. His generals sent word of skirmishes and negotiations on distant frontiers. Priests and diviners wrote of omens read in the livers of sacrificial animals, or of dreams that foretold both promise and danger. The king himself issued commands, sometimes stern, sometimes conciliatory, always with an awareness that every decision carried consequences. One letter describes the king's reliance on divination before embarking on military campaigns. The priest reported the patterns of entrails, the shape of the stars, and the flight of birds. To Zimri Lim, the will of the gods was not abstract. It was a voice that spoke through signs, guiding the path of kingship. Another letter reveals the king's concern for his queens and household, as he instructed their protection while he marched with the army. Through such details, the figure of the monarch emerges as both sacred and human, balancing divine mandate with the intimate ties of family and survival. Perhaps most striking is the way these letters reveal a world of constant negotiation. Kingship was not absolute. Zimri-Lim ruled through a fragile web of alliances, pacts, and rivalries. His neighbors included the ambitious Hammurabi of Babylon, the restless city of Eshnunna, and shifting tribal confederations. Envoys carried messages across long distances, offering gifts and seeking favor. Marriage itself became a tool of politics. One of Zimri-Lim's daughters was married to the king of Aleppo, cementing an alliance through blood and kinship. Every relationship, whether diplomatic or divine, required tending, reassurance, and vigilance. The archives also reveal moments of profound ritual. In one preserved account, Zimri-Lim participates in a sacred procession, receiving the blessings of deities and reaffirming his role as intermediary between gods and men. The walls of the Mari Palace, adorned with murals of goddesses pouring water from sacred vases, echo this intertwining of myth and monarchy. Kingship was never only about politics. It was staged as cosmic theatre, where the ruler's authority was bound to the divine forces of fertility, justice, and war. And yet, for all its richness, Mari's story is shadowed by sudden silence. In 1761 BCE, Hammurabi of Babylon, once Zimri-Lim's ally, turned against him. Babylonian armies descended upon Mari, and the city that had flourished for centuries was destroyed. The palace burned, its walls collapsing, sealing the archives beneath rubble and ash. Zimri-Lim vanished from the historical stage, and Hammurabi's consolidation of Mesopotamia advanced. What remained was an unfinished conversation. The letters cut short, the dialogue of kingship abruptly silenced. It is this very destruction that preserved Mari's archive. Fire baked the clay tablets, turning them from fragile writing surfaces into durable artifacts that endured nearly 4 millennia beneath the sands of Syria. Their survival is an accident of ruin, a paradox where catastrophe becomes preservation. Without Hammurabi's conquest, the words of Mari's kings and scribes might have dissolved into dust. Instead, they remain frozen at the moment of conquest, a final snapshot of a living world extinguished. Today, as scholars pore over these texts, they glimpse the human side of monarchy in ways that other sources rarely allow. We read of disputes between rival governors, of messengers delayed by floods, of gifts exchanged between courts. We see the rhythm of diplomacy, the pulse of administration, and the heartbeat of ritual. And through it all, the figure of Zimri-Lim remains, part commander, part priest, part husband and father, yet always vulnerable to forces beyond his control. The letters raise as many questions as they answer. What did Zimri-Lim feel when he learned that Hammurabi had betrayed their alliance? Did he sense, in the omens and warnings sent by his diviners, that the fall of Mari was near? Did he believe that his devotion to the gods would shield his city? Or did he go to his end still negotiating, still hoping for another alliance to save him? These questions remain suspended in silence, for the archive closes abruptly, leaving us with fragments of thought, unfinished conversations, and unanswered appeals. Standing amid the ruins of Mari today, one sees little more than low walls of mud brick and the faint outlines of courtyards. Yet beneath the dust, the voices of the past linger. Thousands of tablets, once carried by messengers across Mesopotamia, still whisper of alliances forged and broken, of omens read and interpreted, of kings who sought to bind heaven and earth together through ritual and command. The story of Mari and its letters is not just a tale of one king's reign. It is a reminder of the fragility of human ambition, the brevity of alliances, and the power of words to endure beyond fire and ruin. The palace is gone. The murals have faded. The dynasty of Zimri-Lim has long been erased. But the letters remain, small, clay-bound fragments of thought that speak more intimately than any monument of stone. And so, we are left to wonder, was Mari's destruction a tragic accident of history? Or was it part of the eternal cycle in which new powers rise only through the ashes of the old? The archive preserves not an ending, but a silence, a gap where voices fall quiet and history moves on without them. In that silence, we hear both the fragility and the endurance of kingship, forever caught between the fires of destruction and the clay that outlives it. Chapter 21. The Kassite dynasty and long kingship. The fall of Hammurabi's Babylon brought no peace. For centuries after his death, the land of Mesopotamia was fractured, pulled between foreign invaders, local rivalries, and shifting powers that rose and fell with unsettling speed. The Hittites swept down from Anatolia around 1595 BCE, sacking Babylon and leaving the once mighty city in smouldering ruin. For generations, the throne of Babylon seemed cursed, claimed and reclaimed by rulers whose reigns were brief, uncertain, and haunted by instability. And then, in the midst of this turbulence, a new dynasty took root, foreign in origin, but destined to endure. The Kassites, a people whose homeland lay to the east in the Zagros Mountains, emerged as Babylon's unlikely stabilizers. From about 1595 to 1155 BCE, they ruled for more than 4 centuries, the longest continuous dynasty in Babylonian history. In a world where kingship so often flickered like a flame against the winds of conquest, the Kassite line burned steadily, reshaping what it meant for monarchy to endure. Yet the Kassites remain elusive. Unlike the grand proclamations of Hammurabi or the bold inscriptions of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, the Kassites left few monuments to boast of their deeds. Their kings carved little in stone. Their voices seldom thundered in long inscriptions. Instead, they ruled in subtler ways, their presence woven quietly into the fabric of Mesopotamian tradition. They blended into the land they had conquered, adopting Babylonian language, religion, and administrative forms, while slowly infusing them with their own rights and titles. Archaeology offers fragments of their legacy. At the site of Dur-Kurigalzu, near modern Baghdad, stands one of their rare monumental projects, a massive ziggurat commissioned by King Kurigalzu the Fun in the 14th century BCE. Rising tier upon tier, its bricks bound by bitumen, it mirrored the ancient Sumerian tradition of linking heaven and earth through sacred architecture. Yet this monument is the exception rather than the rule. Unlike earlier dynasties, the Kassites did not seek immortality through sheer stone, but through the longevity of their rule and the continuity of their institutions. They introduced new royal titles, among them Shah Kishati, King of the Universe, a claim that echoed older Mesopotamian pretensions, but carried fresh resonance under Kassite reign. They also emphasized their role as guardians of the Babylonian gods. Above all, Marduk, whose cult became the central axis of their legitimacy. Even though the Kassites were outsiders by blood, they proved themselves insiders by devotion. They restored Babylon's temples, enriched its priesthoods, and ensured that the rhythms of religious life continued uninterrupted. Kingship, for the Kassites, was survival through continuity, a sacred stewardship rather than conquest. But traces of their foreign origins did not vanish completely. The Kassites introduced divine symbols and rituals that appear only faintly in earlier Babylonian tradition. They revered a sun god named Shuriash, distinct from Shamash, and a horse god who reflected their roots as mountain and steppe dwellers. The horse itself, an animal rarely emphasized in earlier Mesopotamian culture, became increasingly important under their reign. Kassite seals and artifacts show horses adorned with care, suggesting their use in chariots and ritual display. In this, the dynasty subtly shifted the texture of Mesopotamian kingship, blending mountain traditions with the settled rituals of the river plains. Their endurance is perhaps their greatest mystery. While earlier dynasties collapsed under invasion or internal unrest, Kassite kings often reigned for decades, some for more than 40 years. Burnaburiash II ruled for nearly half a century, overseeing diplomacy that reached far beyond Mesopotamia. Letters from his reign, preserved in the Amarna archives of Egypt, reveal a king at the center of an international system. He corresponded with pharaohs, exchanged gifts of lapis lazuli and horses, and demanded gold in return. In these letters, we see Babylon under Kassite rule not as a broken remnant, but as a stable power engaged in the great game of Bronze Age diplomacy. And yet, despite this reach, their rule feels curiously quiet in the archaeological record. Few statues survive, fewer inscriptions. Unlike Hammurabi's stele, no single monument proclaims Kassite lore. Unlike Shulgi's hymns, no royal songs echo with their names. They are known instead through absence, through lists of kings, scattered inscriptions, and tablets of tribute. Some scholars suggest that this silence may itself have been intentional, a different philosophy of kingship that eschewed self-glorification in favor of quiet endurance. Others wonder whether much of their record simply lies undiscovered, still buried beneath Mesopotamia's shifting soils. The Kassite dynasty eventually faltered under the weight of foreign pressures. The Elamites, rising from the east, sacked Babylon in 1155 BCE, carrying off the statue of Marduk itself as plunder. With that act, Kassite power dissolved, and a new age of Mesopotamian kingship began. But the Kassites had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that monarchy in Mesopotamia could adapt, absorbing foreign rulers into its traditions, while allowing those rulers to imprint something of their own. Their reign is a reminder that kingship is not always carved in stone. Sometimes it survives not through monuments or proclamations, but through continuity, patience, and the weaving of foreign threads into an ancient tapestry. The Kassites left behind little to dazzle the eye, but they left behind centuries of stability in a world otherwise defined by collapse and conquest. And so their dynasty lingers like a shadow, long, steady, and indistinct. We know they ruled, we know they endured, but the texture of their reign slips between our fingers. Were they truly content to rule quietly, leaving no grand record of their deeds? Or have their voices simply been lost, waiting still beneath the dust for discovery? In their silence lies both absence and endurance, a paradox of kingship that is felt more than it is seen. Their story draws us deeper into the mystery of monarchy itself, where power is not always proclaimed, but sometimes whispered, stretched across generations like an unbroken thread. Chapter 22. The Hittite Sack of Babylon. The city of Babylon, jewel of the southern plains, seemed destined for eternity. Under Hammurabi and his heirs, its walls had stood proud, its temples filled with offerings, its kings proclaimed as chosen of the gods. Yet history shows that even the mightiest kingdoms can shatter in an instant. Around 1595 BCE, Babylon, center of Mesopotamian kingship, was struck down in a raid so sudden and so decisive that its monarchy dissolved overnight. The invaders were the Hittites, a power from Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the northwest. Their assault would mark a turning point in Mesopotamian history, and yet it remains shrouded in silence, its motives unclear, its memory blurred by myth. The Hittites themselves were no ordinary aggressors. From their capital at Hattusa, in the mountains of central Anatolia, they had already established themselves as formidable conquerors. Their armies marched with chariots, their kings claimed descent from the storm god, and their scribes left behind archives that reveal both ruthless ambition and pragmatic diplomacy. By the mid-17th century BCE, they had grown bold enough to strike deep into the lands of the Euphrates. Babylon, weakened by internal struggles and the exhaustion of Hammurabi's successors, lay vulnerable. The raid was swift. Little is recorded of the battle itself. No Babylonian king left an inscription lamenting the city's fall. No epic poem immortalized the clash. What we know comes mostly from later chronicles, fragments of Hittite texts, and echoes in Mesopotamian tradition. They agree on one fact: Babylon's dynasty collapsed, and the city was sacked. The Hittites did not linger. Unlike conquerors who sought to rule, they seem to have plundered the city and withdrawn, returning to Anatolia with treasures and captives. Their strike was less an empire-building conquest than a devastating blow, a reminder of how far their reach could extend. For Mesopotamia, the impact was profound. Babylon had been the axis around which kingship revolved. Hammurabi's laws, his conquests, and his consolidation of territory had given the impression of permanence, as if Babylon's rule would endure unbroken. Yet in a single campaign, the illusion of eternal stability was shattered. The fall of the city left a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum stepped the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains, who would eventually rebuild Babylonian kingship in their own image. Later, Mesopotamian scribes did not forget this catastrophe. They retold it not as the result of Hittite ambition, but as divine judgment. In their chronicles, the sack of Babylon was punishment from the gods, proof that kings who failed to honor the divine order would be cast down. In this sense, the event became mythologized, woven into the larger pattern of Mesopotamian memory, where every fall of a dynasty was seen as part of the eternal cycle of divine favor and divine wrath. Babylon's collapse was not merely political, it was theological, a rupture between king and gods. Yet questions linger. Why did the Hittites strike Babylon at all? Their homeland lay far from the southern plains, and their campaigns typically focused on closer rivals in Syria and Anatolia. Some scholars suggest that Babylon lay at the end of a larger campaign, its riches too tempting to ignore. Others wonder if Babylon had become entangled in wider conflicts, perhaps as an ally of Hittite enemies, drawing the storm upon itself. Whatever the reason, the silence of sources leaves the episode suspended in uncertainty, a shadowed strike in the tapestry of history. Archaeology too offers little certainty. Babylon's layers are deep, its ruins obscured by later rebuilding and the shifting sands of time. No definitive destruction layer has been firmly tied to the Hittite sack, leaving scholars to piece together fragments from texts and later memory. The absence of evidence only deepens the mystery. Was the city truly burned or simply plundered? Did the Hittites desecrate its temples, or did the Kassites later rebuild over them without leaving traces? In this silence, the Hittite sack becomes less a clear event and more a haunting reminder of how fragile the record of the past remains. The story of Babylon's fall is, at its heart, a meditation on fragility. Kingship in Mesopotamia always carried the aura of permanence, bound to gods and inscribed in stone. Yet behind the monumental facades, power could vanish overnight. Hammurabi's dynasty had crafted laws, temples, and traditions that promised eternal order, but no law code could shield Babylon from the chariots of foreign kings. In this lies the paradox of monarchy. Proclaimed as eternal, it was always vulnerable to the unexpected storm. The Hittite sack also foreshadows patterns that would repeat throughout Babylon's history. Again and again, foreign invaders would descend upon the city: Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, each time reshaping the monarchy, each time reminding its rulers that no throne was unshakable. The sack of 1595 BCE was the first such rupture, a grim precedent written into the city's destiny. And yet, the Hittites themselves did not hold Babylon. Their strike was devastating but fleeting. In their wake, the Kassites rose, claiming the throne and ruling for centuries, their dynasty longer than any before. Perhaps here lies another lesson of the sack, that in Mesopotamia, destruction often cleared the ground for renewal, and the end of one dynasty was never the end of kingship itself. Still, we cannot escape the haunting silence. No Babylonian scribe described the horror of that day. No eyewitness account tells us what became of the city's people, its temples, its rulers. The memory survives only in fragments, refracted through the lens of later scribes who shaped it into theology, a lesson in the impermanence of human power before the will of the gods. The sack of Babylon by the Hittites stands at the edge of history and myth, an event real enough to topple dynasties, yet elusive enough to remain shrouded in shadow. It whispers to us across millennia, reminding us how fragile even the grandest of monarchies could be, and how quickly the favor of the gods, or the arrival of an unexpected army, could turn glory into ruin. Chapter 23. Assyrian Kingship and the Temple of Ashur. The Assyrians did not imagine their king merely as a ruler of men. He was, first and foremost, the earthly weapon of their god. In their worldview, every battle fought, every city subdued, every wall toppled, was not for the enrichment of the throne or the vanity of the monarch. It was service, a relentless offering of conquest to Ashur, the national god whose name defined their land. Kingship here was not diplomacy, nor a fragile balancing act of trade and tribute. It was an eternal campaign, a ceaseless march into foreign lands, carried out with divine sanction. The roots of this belief stretch back to the small city of Assur, nestled on the banks of the Tigris. Around 2000 BCE, when the first settlers raised temples and shrines there, they forged a unique covenant with their deity. Ashur was not distant like Enlil of Nippur or Marduk of Babylon. He was present, local, embodied in the city itself. His temple stood at the heart of Assur, and within its walls, the destiny of kingship was written. Unlike other Mesopotamian traditions where the gods placed a crown upon a monarch's head, the Assyrian king was not crowned in his palace. He was crowned within the temple of Ashur, beneath the gaze of the divine, and he reigned as the god's chosen general. Archaeologists have uncovered foundations and fragments of this temple complex, rebuilt and expanded over centuries. Reliefs and inscriptions tell of rituals where the king would return from his campaigns, laying before Ashur the spoils of war: gold, silver, livestock, even captives. The temple became not just a house of worship, but the symbolic throne room of empire, where victories were recorded as divine triumphs. The king could not separate his identity from this sacred duty. If he ceased to conquer, he ceased to serve. By the 14th century BCE, Assyria had begun to emerge from a modest kingdom into a power whose influence spread across Mesopotamia. It was kings like Ashur-uballit I who first stretched the Assyrian vision beyond the Tigris Valley. In the clay letters exchanged with pharaohs of Egypt, we see the first echoes of an idea that would later dominate the ancient world. Assyria did not merely seek alliances, it sought submission. The king's role was never to coexist, but to compel. And always, this expansion was justified as the will of Ashur. Centuries later, under the great rulers of the Neo-Assyrian period, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, the ideology of divine kingship reached its most terrifying clarity. Their annals, etched into stone and clay, speak in thunderous tones. Cities were razed by command of Ashur. Kings were shackled beneath the yoke of Ashur. Foreign peoples were uprooted and resettled as the god decreed. These were not merely political actions, they were sacred acts inscribed into cosmic order. To resist the Assyrian king was to resist the god himself. The walls of their palaces, uncovered at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Khorsabad, still whisper this doctrine. Relief carvings depict the monarch in larger-than-life proportions, bow taut, chariot thundering forward, trampling enemies beneath iron wheels. But look closer, and you will see Ashur's sacred symbol hovering above, the winged disc, guiding the king's arrows, sanctifying his march. These were not scenes of human glory, they were visual theologies, reminders that conquest was worship. The temple of Ashur in the Old City remained the heart of this vision. Even when Assyria's capital shifted from Assur to Kalhu to Nineveh, the sacred rites at Ashur endured. Kings were enthroned there, returning to the ancient seat to acknowledge their debt to the god. In ritual processions, statues of Ashur were carried through the streets, while the king walked beside, not as equal, but as servant. Within the holy chamber, he reaffirmed his vow to wage war unceasingly, to expand the borders, to break the strength of rivals. Yet woven into this relentless ideology was also a deep fragility. If conquest was worship, then defeat was sacrilege. When Sennacherib's armies failed to capture Jerusalem, scribes did not record it as failure. They reshaped the story. The king had simply shut Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. To admit loss was to suggest Ashur's will had faltered. And when, centuries later, Nineveh itself fell in 612 BCE, the collapse of Assyria was not merely political, it was theological. The sacred covenant between God and king had shattered. The archaeology of Assyria reveals this tension between glory and doom. Excavators at Nineveh uncovered the vast library of Ashurbanipal, clay tablets filled with incantations, omens, and histories. Within them, one finds not only the proud proclamations of kings, but also rituals meant to ward off evil, to reverse omens of defeat, to appease angry gods. Behind the facade of eternal conquest lay the gnawing fear that Ashur's favor might wane. Even the imagery of the winged disc, once a blazing symbol of divine mandate, is ambiguous. Scholars debate whether it represents Ashur himself or a symbol of divine presence. Some suggest it echoes older solar iconography, connecting Assyria to a broader tradition of kingship under the sun. Whatever its origin, its meaning was clear to the Assyrians. The king did not march alone. His victories were not his own. This theology of endless warfare left its mark on how the Assyrians are remembered. To their enemies, they were ruthless conquerors, wielding terror as a weapon. To themselves, they were servants of a god whose demands could never be satisfied. Their palaces displayed scenes of flayed captives, severed heads, and burning cities, not as cruelty for its own sake, but as proof of devotion. Each act of destruction was a sacrifice. Each campaign was a liturgy. And yet, the silence of the ruins speaks of another reality. The city of Assur today lies broken, its once sacred temple reduced to foundations. The great palaces of Nineveh are fragmented reliefs in distant museums. The Assyrian Empire, built on conquest as sacred service, endured for centuries, but fell in a single storm of invasion. Its theology, unable to protect it from human armies. Was Ashur silent in that hour, or did his worshippers misunderstand the true nature of their covenant? Perhaps that is why the memory of Assyrian kingship is both awe-inspiring and unsettling. It presents us with a vision of monarchy, unlike that of Babylon or Egypt. Here, the king was not mediator, not shepherd, not builder of peace. He was an instrument of war, forged in the temple, wielded by a god, and discarded when broken. It is a model of kingship that draws us into a darker truth. That divine power, once entwined with earthly rule, demands an obedience that can consume nations. And so we leave the shadowed halls of Assyria with questions lingering. What does it mean to tie a god's will to conquest without end? Was the empire's fall the undoing of its theology or its inevitable outcome? Among the shattered stones of Assur, the temple of Ashur no longer resounds with chants of war. Yet the idea remains, echoing faintly across time, that some kings are not rulers at all, but weapons in the hands of their gods. Chapter 24. Tukulti-Ninurta. I am the epic of kingship, in the long lineage of Assyrian monarchs. One name glimmers with both brilliance and tragedy, Tukulti-Ninurta. His reign, stretching from 1243 to 1207 BCE, was marked by conquests of astonishing boldness, innovations in royal ideology, and finally, betrayal so intimate it pierced the very heart of kingship itself. In him, we see the paradox that haunted Mesopotamian monarchy, a ruler who claimed divine favor with unparalleled confidence, yet could not escape the silent conspiracies of his own blood. Tukulti-Ninurta inherited a throne already bound to the sacred duty of expansion. His forebears had pushed Assyria into prominence, yet he would carry its banner farther still. In annals inscribed upon clay and stone, he proclaims the sweep of his campaigns, victories over the Hittites in the west, the Hurrians to the north, the Elamites to the east. But it was his southern conquest that shook the political and spiritual order of Mesopotamia. He marched into Babylon, the city that had so often stood as Assyria's rival and mirror, and he did the unthinkable. He not only defeated Babylon, he declared himself its king. This act was more than military triumph. It was ideological transgression. For centuries, the kings of Assyria and Babylon had defined themselves against one another, two poles of Mesopotamian kingship. Babylon was the city of Marduk, the god whose priests proclaimed him supreme over all. Ashur, by contrast, was the war god who demanded ceaseless expansion. For an Assyrian king to sit on the throne of Babylon was to collapse this duality, to lay claim to both sacred lineages. It was a daring attempt to fuse the two centers of Mesopotamian power into one crown. To sanctify this audacity, Tukulti-Ninurta turned to poetry. What survives of the Tukulti-Ninurta epic reads like both hymn and propaganda. In it, the god Ashur himself proclaims that the Assyrian king is chosen to punish Babylon for its sins, to humble its rulers, to bring divine justice with the sword. The text resonates with echoes of older Sumerian and Akkadian hymns, yet it carries a sharper edge. Tukulti-Ninurta is cast not merely as steward or shepherd, but as divine executioner. In his hands, conquest becomes judgment, war becomes liturgy. The epic served two purposes. To his own people, it reaffirmed that the king's triumphs were no mere human victories, but cosmic mandates. To the Babylonians, it was a declaration of humiliation, a rewriting of their story in Assyria's voice. Here was a monarch not content to rule through force alone. He sought to redefine the very narrative of kingship across Mesopotamia. And yet, within the palace walls of Assur, another story was unfolding. The chronicles tell us that Tukulti-Ninurta's reign ended in violence, not at the hands of foreign enemies, but through betrayal by his own sons. As he aged, tensions within the royal court deepened. Perhaps it was the burden of his innovations, perhaps resentment at his harshness, perhaps the simple rivalries that so often haunted dynasties. Whatever the cause, the ending was brutal. The king was seized and assassinated by those who should have been his heirs. Here lies the paradox. Publicly, the king's voice rang with divine sanction, immortalized in epic verse. He was Ashur's chosen, triumphant over Babylon, crowned with cosmic authority. But within his household, that authority proved brittle. If even the sons of the king could see fit to spill royal blood, what does that say of the foundations upon which monarchy rested? The archaeology of Tukulti-Ninurta's reign reflects this tension. He built a new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, just across the Tigris from Assur. Its layout was ambitious. Temples, palaces, administrative centers, all constructed to enshrine his authority. Yet the city did not endure. After his death, it was abandoned, left to crumble in the dust. Like the epic itself, the city was an attempt at permanence, at embedding the king's vision in the world. But permanence proved fleeting, and still, his story has endured. The fragments of the epic survive, copied by later scribes, studied by modern scholars. They show us a king who understood the power of narrative, who sought not only to conquer lands, but to conquer memory. In this way, Tukulti-Ninurta belongs not just to Assyria, but to the broader lineage of rulers who saw themselves as poets of their own reigns, crafting legacies in words as well as in deeds. Yet his assassination whispers another lesson. That kingship, however divine in rhetoric, was always human in reality. Behind the tablets and epics were families, jealousies, rivalries. Behind the thunder of conquests lay the silence of plots whispered in dark corridors. Tukulti-Ninurta's reign reminds us that the Assyrian king was never merely a figure of awe, but also a man vulnerable to the oldest of human struggles. The contest between father and sons, between power and ambition. We are left with a haunting image. A king proclaimed chosen of the gods, conqueror of Babylon, author of his own epic, and yet a king whose end came not in battle but in betrayal. Was this irony or inevitability? Was his assassination a rupture in the divine order he proclaimed, or its dark fulfillment? The epic does not tell us. The ruins of Kar Tukulti-Ninurta do not tell us. They lie silent, wind-blown, their bricks eroded by centuries. Perhaps they remind us that even the boldest claims to eternity are vulnerable to the passage of time. Perhaps they remind us that monarchy, however exalted, was never unassailable. In the figure of Tukulti-Ninurta, the paradox of kingship stands in sharp relief. Divine favor carved in stone and sung in verse, undone by daggers in the night. And so, the story of kingship moves forward, always balancing between proclamation and fragility, between the thunder of the gods and the whispers of men. Chapter 25. The Neo-Assyrian, King of the Universe. By the first millennium before our era, the kings of Assyria had embraced a vision of monarchy unlike anything the ancient Near East had seen before. Where earlier rulers had claimed dominion over cities, regions, or perhaps the four quarters of the world, the Neo-Assyrian kings reached for an even grander title. They styled themselves Shar-Kishati, the king of the universe. In their inscriptions, the horizon itself bent beneath their rule, and the breadth of the known world was portrayed as a realm subdued under their gaze. The rise of this audacious kingship coincided with the expansion of Assyria from a regional power into the largest empire Mesopotamia had yet produced. By the mid-8th century BCE, under kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, the state was transformed into a machinery of conquest. Campaign after campaign carried Assyrian armies outward, to the Levant, to Anatolia, to the highlands of Iran, to the southern marshes of Babylonia. No corner of the Near East seemed untouched by their reach. It was in this atmosphere of relentless expansion that the rhetoric of universal dominion found fertile ground. The royal annals preserved on stone and clay leave little doubt about how these kings wished to be remembered. They proclaim victories in detail, listing cities burned, peoples deported, tributes extracted. Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE, reorganized the empire into provinces governed directly by Assyrian officials. In doing so, he broke with the older model of distant vassals and local kings. His inscriptions tell us that the world itself bent to his authority, that kings far and near trembled before his messengers. For him, the claim of universal kingship was not simply poetic. It was an administrative reality enforced through iron control. Later rulers carried this vision to new heights. Sennacherib, remembered both for his campaigns and for his rebuilding of Nineveh, styled himself not only king of the universe, but king of the four quarters. His palace at Nineveh was so vast that it became known as the palace without rival. Reliefs carved into its walls depict endless processions of tribute, sieges of distant cities, and scenes of conquest that stretch like eternal banners of domination. For those who walked its halls, there could be no doubt that Assyrian kingship was meant to appear limitless. Archaeology has preserved fragments of this vision. The stone slabs unearthed at Nimrud and Nineveh show in painstaking detail the artistry of power. Rows of soldiers, kings enthroned beneath winged deities, enemy rulers groveling in submission. The famous reliefs of the Siege of Lachish, discovered in Sennacherib's palace, illustrate not only military might, but the ideology of total domination. To look upon them was to be reminded that resistance to Assyria was futile, that even the most fortified cities could be razed and their people scattered. And yet, these images reveal as much about aspiration as about reality. Behind the rhetoric of cosmic kingship lay a world that was never fully subdued. Rebellions erupted again and again. Babylon remained both jewel and thorn, alternately conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt. In the Levant, local rulers sought Egyptian aid to resist Assyrian control. Even within Assyria's borders, conquered peoples plotted their freedom, waiting for the moment when imperial strength faltered. The title, King of the Universe, thus carried within it a paradox. On the one hand, it elevated the king into a figure of almost divine omnipotence, standing at the center of a world ordered by conquest. On the other, it betrayed the insecurity of rule, the need to proclaim total dominion precisely because dominion was always contested. The grandeur of the title masked the fragility of empire. The mythology of Assyrian kingship fused conquest with cosmic order. The king was not merely a general, he was the earthly agent of Asher, the national god whose will demanded perpetual expansion. To refuse the Assyrian king was to rebel against the divine itself. This theology of conquest sanctified war, transforming brutality into sacred duty. Deportations of entire populations, recorded in proud detail by the scribes, were presented not as cruelty, but as instruments of divine justice. In this way, kingship as universal dominion was not only political, but also liturgical, an empire of both soldiers and scribes, spears and prayers. Still, the monumental palaces, the annals, and the very titles of these kings carry an undertone of overreach. For all their boasting, the empire would not endure. By the late 7th century BCE, cracks began to appear. Civil war weakened Assyria from within. External enemies, Medes, Babylonians, Scythians, pressed upon its borders. In 612 BCE, Nineveh itself fell in a storm of fire and ruin. The palace without rival was reduced to rubble, its reliefs buried beneath ash and soil. The king of the universe was no more, and so the ruins speak their quiet truth. The grand vision of universal dominion, inscribed so confidently in annals and carved so meticulously into stone, has come down to us in fragments. The slabs of Nimrud rest in museums, far from their original halls. The inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib are studied as texts stripped of their terror. The title, King of the Universe, lingers in memory, but the empires it once adorned are long gone. Was this inevitable? Perhaps the very claim to universal kingship invited collapse, for no mortal throne can carry the weight of eternity. Perhaps the Assyrians, in reaching for the cosmos, set themselves upon a path where the fall would be as monumental as the rise. Or perhaps this cycle was the essence of kingship itself in Mesopotamia, to claim the world, to rule for a time, and then to vanish, leaving only broken reliefs and buried palaces. The story of the King of the Universe is not merely about power. It is about the tension between ambition and mortality, between divine sanction and human fragility. In the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud, in the shattered stones that once proclaimed eternal rule, we hear the echo of a truth that outlasts empires. Even universal kingship is impermanent, and still, the words of the Assyrian scribes whisper across the centuries. They remind us of a moment when kings dared to name themselves masters of all, when palaces proclaimed the world as one dominion, when the throne was envisioned as the axis of the universe itself. A vision both awe-inspiring and doomed, preserved in fragments, awaiting those who would search the dust of history to hear its echo once more. Chapter 26. The Library of Ashurbanipalin, the twilight centuries of Mesopotamian power. When empires rose and fell with startling speed, one king sought not only to dominate the world with armies, but also to bind eternity with clay. His name was Ashurbanipal, last of the great Neo-Assyrian monarchs, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. His reign was marked by conquest and splendor, but also by something quieter, something that would outlast the thunder of his armies. A library. Upon the banks of the Tigris, in the royal city of Nineveh, Ashurbanipal ordered the gathering of knowledge from every corner of his realm. Clay tablets inscribed in the wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform were collected, copied, and carefully stored in palace chambers. The king's vision was audacious, to bring together the memory of civilizations, not only of Assyria, but of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and beyond. What he assembled would become the most complete archive of the ancient Near East, a treasury of myths, rituals, omens, and chronicles. Unlike many of his forebears, Ashurbanipal was not merely a patron of scribes, he was himself a scholar. He boasted in his inscriptions that he could read the signs of Sumer and decipher the languages of bygone ages. He described himself as one who had mastered the craft of the scribal art, an unusual claim for a king whose hands were more often remembered for the sword. This merging of ruler and reader was itself a statement of kingship. To conquer was not enough. One must also remember, preserve, and judge through the knowledge of ages. The library contained an astonishing variety of texts. There were incantations against disease, prayers to the gods, and omens drawn from the stars. There were detailed medical treatises, tax records, royal decrees, and the grim mathematics of empire. But among these clay tablets also lay poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh was found here in its fullest form. The tale of the restless king, seeking immortality, only to learn that it exists not in flesh, but in words and deeds preserved. Other myths too survived, only because they were pressed into clay at Ashurbanipal's command. The descent of Ishtar into the underworld, the wars of the gods, the flood stories older than the Bible itself. Without the library, these voices might have vanished. Archaeology has given us a glimpse of its scale. When the ruins of Nineveh were excavated in the mid-19th century, tens of thousands of broken tablets came to light, scattered and fragmented. Many were discovered in the very palace rooms where Assyrian soldiers once strategized and scribes once bent over wet clay. Fires, caused by the city's destruction in 612 BCE, had hardened many tablets, baking them into permanence. Ironically, the violence that sought to erase Assyria ensured the survival of its memory. Ashurbanipal's motives remain a matter of debate. Some scholars see the library as a practical tool, a repository of omens, rituals, and political knowledge that would help the king rule and defend his empire. Others view it as an act of cultural preservation, a conscious attempt to preserve the ancient wisdom of Mesopotamia. Perhaps it was both. Yet one cannot help but sense in the project a deeper instinct, an awareness of impermanence. Even the most powerful empire could crumble, but clay might endure where walls and palaces would not. The image of Ashurbanipal himself is paradoxical. Reliefs from his palace depict him as a mighty hunter, loosing arrows into lions, crushing his enemies, parading the heads of conquered kings. He was ruthless in war, expanding Assyrian dominion with brutality that terrorized the Near East. And yet, in the same palace, he gathered myths of creation, records of healing, and stories of human longing. To modern eyes, it is almost as though he sought to reconcile two halves of kingship, the destroyer and the custodian. There is mystery, too, in the survival of the library. Why did the invaders who razed Nineveh not obliterate the clay archives? Was it neglect, mere accident of war, that left them beneath the rubble? Or did some unspoken reverence for written knowledge spare them from total annihilation? The question lingers, as though some unseen hand had guided the preservation of Mesopotamia's voice through time. What survived is fragmentary, incomplete. Many tablets are broken, their narratives interrupted by missing lines, like a song heard only in echo. Yet even in fragments, the library speaks. It speaks of an ancient desire to make sense of the cosmos, to know the will of the gods, to preserve memory against oblivion. Ashurbanipal's library was more than a royal collection. It was an ark of civilization, bearing forward the weight of millennia. In the ruins of Nineveh today, one can still imagine the quiet scratching of styluses across damp clay, the whisper of scribes moving between shelves, the glow of lamplight upon rows of tablets. Each stroke of cuneiform was a prayer against forgetting, and in some strange way, the prayer was answered. For though Ashurbanipal's empire fell, though Nineveh was consumed by fire and fury, his words remain. His library whispers across 3,000 years, carrying forward not only the triumphs of kings, but the myths, the fears, and the dreams of humanity itself. The last great Assyrian king declared himself Lord of the world. His palaces now lie in dust, but the library endures, silent, broken, yet alive. A paradox of history. The sword rusts, the empire vanishes, but the clay remembers. And as we read those tablets today, we are drawn into the same uncertainty that haunted Ashurbanipal himself. Is it conquest that endures, or memory? And so, in the ashes of Nineveh, the story of kingship begins to change. It is no longer only a tale of power and conquest. It becomes a tale of guardianship, of knowledge, of myth, of fragile words pressed into clay against the march of time. Somewhere in that library, beneath the dust of shattered tablets, lies a truth that no king could fully master. That memory, once born, has a life of its own. The library of Ashurbanipal remains both monument and riddle. It preserved the ancient world's wisdom, but it also reminds us how fragile wisdom truly is, how it survives by chance, by fire, by the faint instinct of human hands to keep the record alive. And as the lamps of Nineveh fade in the mind's eye, we are left with a lingering silence, a silence filled with the weight of all that was saved and all that was lost. Chapter 27. The fall of Nineveh and the end of Assyrian kingship in the year 612. BCE, the great city of Nineveh burned. Its colossal walls, once thought impregnable, were breached by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Flames consumed its palaces, and the proud voice of Assyria, once proclaimed across the world, was reduced to silence. The empire that had styled its monarchs as kings of the universe fell not in centuries of gradual decline, but in a storm of fire and steel, sudden and complete. For centuries, the Assyrian kings had stood as towering figures of power, from Ashurnasirpal to Tiglath-Pileser, from Sargon to Sennacherib. Their armies had marched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Mediterranean. They carved their dominion into stone reliefs, showing prisoners in chains, tribute brought in endless procession, and conquered kings kneeling before the Assyrian throne. Theirs was an empire of spectacle and terror, one that seemed eternal. And yet, beneath that aura of permanence, there was fragility. Assyria's power rested on ceaseless conquest, on a military machine that had to be fed with new territories, new wealth, and new subjects. Every victory expanded the empire's reach, but also stretched its borders thinner. Resentment grew among conquered peoples. Rebellions flared, suppressed with brutality, but never entirely extinguished. The very reputation for terror that had once cowed enemies began to unite them against their overlords. When the storm finally came, it came with swiftness. The Babylonians, heirs of an older tradition, and the Medes, rising from the mountains of the east, joined forces. For generations, each had suffered under Assyrian campaigns. Now they saw their chance to strike at the heart of the empire. Cities fell one by one. Ashur, the ancient cultic center, was sacked. Then the coalition turned to Nineveh, the jewel of the Assyrian world, where kings had built vast palaces and declared themselves masters of creation. The siege of Nineveh lasted 3 months. Ancient chronicles describe the Medes and Babylonians surrounding the city, battering its walls and flooding its defenses by diverting the waters of the Tigris. When the walls gave way, the invaders poured in. The royal palaces, adorned with colossal winged bulls and endless reliefs of conquest, were set alight. Fire swept through the libraries, the courts, the storerooms of treasures gathered from across the empire. The city of kings was reduced to rubble. One text, the Babylonian Chronicle, records the moment with chilling simplicity. They carried off the great spoil of the city and the temple, and they turned the city into a ruin heap. To the Babylonians, it was a victory of justice, a reckoning for centuries of Assyrian arrogance. To the Medes, it was the breaking of a rival power. To history, it was the end of an age. Archaeology gives us a haunting vision of that destruction. Excavations at Nineveh have uncovered charred beams, collapsed walls, and masses of broken sculptures. In some places, the fires of 612 BCE still leave traces, burnt layers that testify to the city's sudden death. Reliefs, once brightly painted, now lie shattered in fragments, scattered across the earth. In the ruins of Sennacherib's palace, which had been called the Palace Without Rival, archaeologists found toppled lamassu, those winged guardians meant to ward off chaos. Their fall seemed symbolic, as though the gods themselves had abandoned the Assyrian throne. For centuries, Nineveh had boasted of divine favor. The Assyrian kings styled themselves as chosen of Ashur, as rulers of all lands, as the cosmic center of order. They believed their empire was destined to endure as long as the heavens and the earth. Yet when the city fell, There was no divine hand to intervene, no miracle to save the kingship that had claimed universality. The silence that followed the fire was more powerful than all the boasts carved in stone. In later traditions, the fall of Nineveh was remembered with awe, even with satisfaction. The Hebrew prophets spoke of it as divine judgment, the punishment of a city drunk with blood and cruelty. Nahum, writing at the time, described Nineveh as a lion's den laid waste, its prey scattered, its roars silenced. For others, it was a cautionary tale. The empire that had seemed unstoppable was shown to be mortal. What followed was not merely the end of a dynasty, but the erasure of Assyria itself. Unlike Babylon, which survived conquest and rose again under new kings, Assyria disappeared as a political power. Its people remained, its lands endured, but the name that had once shaken the earth was no longer spoken as a living force. The king of the universe had no heir, and yet even in ruin, Assyria's memory could not be entirely destroyed. Beneath the rubble of Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal lay buried, its tablets hardened by the fires that consumed the palace. Though the empire perished, its words endured, carrying forward the myths and histories of Mesopotamia into later ages. It is a strange irony. The empire of war was annihilated, but the clay of memory survived. The fall of Nineveh stands as one of the great turning points in the ancient world. It marks the collapse of the first true empire of terror, the vanishing of a kingship that had sought to claim the universe itself. But it also reveals the fragility of power, the thinness of the veil that separates majesty from ruin. For centuries, Assyria's kings had believed themselves favored by gods beyond challenge. In the end, their palaces fell as swiftly as any man's house, their glory scattered like ash on the wind. Today, the ruins of Nineveh lie quiet. The city that once thundered with armies and processions is a field of dust and broken stones. Fragments of reliefs lie in museums far from their homeland, silent witnesses to both grandeur and downfall. To walk among them is to feel the echo of a vanished world, a reminder that no empire, however mighty, escapes the wheel of history. The fall of Nineveh is not only a story of destruction, it is a meditation on the impermanence of kingship. The silence that followed was itself a statement, louder than any boast of conquest. It told all who came after, no claim of divine authority, no empire of the sword, can stand forever. And so in 612 BCE, the king of the universe was dethroned not by gods, but by time, by fire, and by the hands of men. The empire of Assyria was gone. What remained was a question, one that lingers still. If even Nineveh could fall, what empire, what throne can truly endure? Chapter 28, the Neo-Babylonian Kings and the Shadow of Empire. In the wake of Assyria's fall, the Near East entered a moment of transformation. From the ashes of Nineveh rose new powers, eager to claim the mantle of universal rule. Among them, it was Babylon that stepped forward with the boldest vision. The city that had once been humbled by Assyrian armies now rose again, not only as a kingdom reborn, but as a beacon of monarchy itself. This was the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, the final flourish of Mesopotamian kingship, and the last time the lands of Sumer and Akkad would shape an empire of their own. The most enduring name from this period is Nebuchadnezzar I, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. To later generations, he became almost mythic, conqueror of Jerusalem, builder of Babylon's walls, patron of temples that seemed to scrape the heavens. His name echoes through the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, and classical histories, caught between memory and legend. Yet behind the myths stands a figure who understood kingship as both sword and spectacle, both conquest and construction. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was transformed. The city became an embodiment of royal grandeur, reshaped with massive fortifications, monumental processional ways, and temples restored to a splendor meant to echo eternity. At its heart rose the great ziggurat known as Etemenanki, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. Later traditions would associate it with the Tower of Babel, a monument of pride that reached too far. To Nebuchadnezzar, it was not pride but devotion, a staircase between earth and sky, a visible reminder that Babylon stood at the center of creation. The Ishtar Gate, still one of the most celebrated monuments of the ancient world, was his triumphal entryway. Its glazed blue bricks adorned with lions, dragons, and bulls proclaimed divine power fused with human mastery. To pass through it was to walk into a city consecrated not just to gods, but to the king who served as their earthly mediator. Along the processional way, reliefs of sacred beasts stood like eternal guardians, as though the very bricks of the city proclaimed, "This is the dwelling place of kingship." Yet Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a builder. He was a conqueror, inheriting the mantle of Near Eastern warfare that had once defined Assyria. His armies marched westward, clashing with Egyptians, laying siege to Tyre, and famously destroying Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The Babylonian chronicles record his campaigns with a stark precision, while the Hebrew scriptures remember the trauma of exile, when the people of Judah were led captive to Babylon. To the victims of conquest, Nebuchadnezzar was the instrument of divine wrath. To Babylonians, he was the king who extended their dominion to the edges of the known world. And yet, there is an undertone in the sources, a shadow beneath the glitter of empire. Kingship in Mesopotamia had always walked a narrow line between divine favor and human fragility. For all his monuments, Nebuchadnezzar left few personal inscriptions compared to Assyrian rulers. His power was proclaimed less in his own words than in the stones he set and the cities he subdued. The silence of his voice is striking, as if the king who remade Babylon chose to let the city itself speak as his monument. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, the dynasty faltered. His successors, Amel-Marduk, Neriglissar, and Nabonidus, struggled to hold the unity of the empire. Nabonidus, the last of the Neo-Babylonian kings, was a figure both unusual and controversial. He withdrew from Babylon for years, residing in the Arabian oasis of Tamar, while entrusting governance to his son Belshazzar. His devotion to the moon god Sin over Marduk, the traditional patron of Babylon, sparked religious unease. To some, Nabonidus was a visionary. To others, a king who abandoned his sacred duties. It was during his reign that Babylon faced the rising power of Persia. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great marched against the city. The accounts of its fall vary. The Babylonian Chronicle describes a swift capture with little resistance, while later, Greek authors told stories of diverted rivers and treachery at the gates. The Cyrus cylinder presents the conqueror not as a destroyer, but as a restorer, chosen by Marduk himself to bring justice and peace. However it occurred, the result was clear. Babylon, the last great Mesopotamian empire, was no longer sovereign. What is most striking is the speed of this transformation. Barely a century separated Nebuchadnezzar's golden age from Babylon's fall. The walls that had been built to proclaim eternal kingship became monuments to transience. The ziggurat of Etemenanke would crumble in the centuries that followed, its bricks quarried, its memory lingering as legend. The Ishtar Gate, dismantled and carried into foreign museums, would survive not as a living threshold, but as a relic of a vanished world. The cycle was complete. From the first kings of Uruk to the mighty Hammurabi, from Assyrian conquerors to Babylon's last monarchs, Mesopotamian kingship had followed a rhythm both majestic and tragic. Each king rose with claims of divine sanction. Each sought to bind heaven and earth through ritual, temple, and conquest. And each, in the end, was brought low, by rival powers, by rebellion, or by the unrelenting passage of time. Archaeology leaves us with fragments of this last chapter, inscriptions praising Nebuchadnezzar's building projects, bricks stamped with royal names, the ruins of palaces that once housed the court of kings, clay tablets preserving accounts of conquest and trade, prayer and astronomy. Each piece is a whisper, a reminder of how much once stood and how much was lost. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty shines as a last flame before the darkness. It was the final time that kingship born in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia ruled as an independent force, shaping the destiny of nations. When Cyrus entered Babylon, Mesopotamian sovereignty ended. From then on, the region would be part of empires greater still: the Persians, the Greeks, the Parthians. The age of local monarchs, tied to the gods of Sumer and Akkad, had passed into memory, and yet the memory endures. The Bible recalls Nebuchadnezzar as the instrument of exile, the tyrant who humbled Jerusalem. Later tradition remembers him as a dreamer, a man haunted by visions of empires rising and falling like statues of clay and gold. To others, he was the builder of wonders, the hanging gardens of Babylon, whether real or imagined, forever linked to his reign. His image wavers between oppressor, visionary, and mythmaker, caught between the fragments of history and the shadow of empire. In the end, The Neo-Babylonian kings remind us of the paradox at the heart of all monarchy. They sought permanence through stone, ritual, and divine favor, yet their splendor was fleeting. Babylon rose as the last voice of Mesopotamian kingship, but even its greatness was swallowed by the tide of history. What remained were ruins, myths, and memories, echoes of a time when the kings of Mesopotamia still believed they ruled at the center of the cosmos. The shadow of empire lingered, long after the kings themselves were gone. Babylon would remain a name of awe, spoken in prophecy, poetry, and legend. Its kings might be dust, its palaces shattered, but its memory was eternal, an echo of the world's first monarchies, whose cycle of rise and fall had now run its course.